Jackal Among Snakes. Author, Nemorosus. Chapter 151, Bitter. Ringing metal echoed through the obsidian abode of the alchemist. Glimmen took slow, heavy steps, eyes glancing around everywhere. He followed a trail of purple lights, though he didn't seem to trust them completely. The uniform hallways and sterile atmosphere of the place seemed to disquiet him. He'd still not had the opportunity to repair his armor after the arm had been severed in the battle with the Lord of Silver, so he raised a bare hand to block his nose as though something ahead smelled foul. He stared down the hall, hesitating to move forward. He reached for his side, retrieving a flask and draining it utterly of the blood within. Once it was gone, he inhaled deeply, and proceeded uncertainly. Ahead, someone breathed through clenched teeth. The breaths were shaky, but strong. Glimmen kept his hand to his nose as though the smell was unbearable. He neared the threshold, steps quiet. He looked into the room first, eyes peeking around the corner, then stopped at the doorway. Glimmen's head turned slowly, drinking in all of the sights. The place was, bluntly put, horrifying. Sheets and blankets were piled up in one corner of the room. Some of them had enough blood on them to be called soaking wet. Annalise had set up a makeshift wash basin in another section of the room, which Glimmen judged she was using for laundry. And though Glimmen had been worried he had drawn the ire of the alchemist by hunting so many of the creatures in the jungle, the food waste remaining evidence that had not been the case. Bones had been picked clean and piled neatly. Glimmen recalled collecting fruits. He saw none, so he presumed they had been eaten fully, seeds and cores included. The centerpiece of the room was the centerpiece of the horror. The bed was the stuff of nightmares. Bloody handprints marked the bedposts, the walls nearby. The bed. If the blankets had been bad, the feather mattress was worse. Glimmen knew from experience that no man possessed that much blood. It was dark blood, too, looking infected. The obsidian floor was covered, some of it dry, some of it fresher. Glimmen would have been certain he was approaching a dead man had he not heard the breathing in the hall. He stepped into the room tentatively, Argrave's form obscured by the tapestries hanging from the four-poster bed. When he came into view, it took a moment for Glimmen to notice Argrave was writing in something. Argrave spared a glance upwards, then looked back to his book. He double-took, lowering the book. "Glimmen," he said, voice surprisingly steady given the state of the room. "Thought you were Annalise." Glimmen surveyed Argrave. His skin was the palest it had ever been. His lips were blue. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. He was missing all of his nails. Strange, jagged abscesses lined his body. The list of symptoms went on and on. Despite this, Glimmen felt an intense vitality radiating from Argrave. It was like the heat of a forge, the strongest of any living thing he'd ever seen. "It's been, what, 7 days?" Argrave continued. "Hard to tell. No windows. Even if there were, we're in a damned cave." Glimmen nodded in confirmation. 7 days. Argrave repeated. "First time I see you in a week." "What, you finally get thirsty?" he questioned with clenched teeth. Followed the sweet aroma, looking for a drink. Glimmen lowered his head. "Lying here in blood puddles and you're provoking the one guy I told you not to engage with." Argrave shouted and tried to point a finger, but he couldn't raise his arm up. The movement seemed to dislodge something, because he started coughing. It was a terrible, word hacking, punctuated by Argrave spitting blood out. "There's your drink." Argrave pointed, then let out a long wheezing laugh. "Christ, I'm losing my mind," he muttered. "I have no defense," conceded Glimmen. Argrave stared up at Glimmen, breathing a little heavy. He adjusted his position, then endeavored to catch his breath, calming himself. As he wiped the blood off his lips, he seemed to be assaulted by pain, because he winced and put his hand to his chest. Glimmen furrowed his brows and stepped forward, concerned. "Listen," Argrave continued. "Listen." "No, don't listen. Don't listen to a word I have to say. I'm in pain, I'm bitter beyond belief, and I'm saying a bunch of words we'll both regret." Argrave outlined. "I know you've been helping with the food." Christ, that's been very helpful. Even eating makes me hungry. It's like I'm trying to gain 200 pounds this month. It's hell. So, forgive the ranting and raving, please." Glimmen stepped a little closer to Argrave's bed. "I make a mistake. And you're asking my forgiveness?" Argrave snorted, but then winced as though the action hurt. Footsteps drew both of their attention, and Annalise entered the room, hefting a sack behind her back. "Argrave, oh," she paused, spotting Glimmen. She stared for a bit, then smiled. "You have come. Good. You make her carry the food in?" Argrave gestured. "Couldn't have carried it inside on your way in?" Didn't want to attract attention, Glimmen excused weakly. Argrave adjusted his book. "Maybe you are an imbecile. I'm starting to question." He moved as though to write again, then stopped. "Darinangam, there." Glimmen looked off to the side, thinking about how to answer this. "Oh, I see. They're still running scared from the big guy." Argrave hefted the book, then laughed with a shake of his head. "Morons and cowards." "I'm bleeding out my—" he began, then stopped himself, taking deep breaths to calm. "Gotta relax." Glimmen looked dissatisfied, like he had something more to say, but he elected to leave it unspoken. He looked around the room. "I'll help clean," he decided. "Scavenge for food, you mean?" Argrave called out. Glimmen shook his head, a bitter smile seizing his face. "You came at a good time," said Annalise as they walked down the halls of the Obsidian Palace. "Sometimes He cannot even speak, cannot think. Seizures and worse assail him. Sometimes? Queried Gilliman. It comes and goes in waves, she explained. It is very. She trailed off. Let us simply say I am glad I am not to be helping him alone. She paused, then looked to Gilliman. You will come back? Yes, Gilliman nodded. I will. No fear of the alchemist any longer? She questioned. Had I drawn his ire? I understand your position, staying outside. Even still, it was foolish, what you did, she admonished. Nothing to fear, Gilliman nodded. Things were settled. Settled? She questioned. You make it sound like you talked with him more. Gilliman stopped walking, staring off to the side. Anneliese came to stand some distance ahead, staring backwards. She studied Gilliman, then crossed her arms. I know you feel guilty, but it does not stem from leaving our grave alone for so long. Does it? Anneliese questioned. Something else bothers you? Yes. And no, Gilliman refuted. I do feel guilty about being away for so long. It's just. What did you do? She demanded quietly. Gilliman hesitated to speak. He started walking again, and Anneliese followed, casting glances at him. The person who initially wished to speak to the alchemist was Garm, Gilliman began. But he has no legs, so if you intend to cast blame, I'm telling the full story. Gilliman cut her off. It has been a very long week, and I am quite irritable as well, Anneliese continued. Say what you wish to say. Garm and Durin weren't afraid to come, Gilliman said plainly. They're doing something with the alchemist. Don't know why, but he had a change of heart. And what are they doing? Anneliese demanded. Gilliman stopped. Finishing up. Wanting something to end tends to make it end slower, or at the very least, that's the human perception of things. That's definitely Argrave's perception of things. He certainly hasn't been bored. Merely constantly occupied. Pain unending. That's been his life. There was no reprieve from it. It warded away sleep, making each day take longer and longer, and it wasn't something that could be gotten used to. It would fade in one point, surge in another. Sometimes, it felt like his appendix had burst. Other moments, a kidney stone passing. Argrave had tried many methods to cope with things. He tried to tell himself that some people lived like this daily, they lived with congenital defects, or were burn victims, things like that. It helped for a bit. He found some strength in that. After a while, though, it started depressing and angering him worse. Elsewise, he often tried to distract himself, writing the report, for instance, or talking with Anneliese. Days of poor sleep rendered most activities extremely difficult and frustrating, though, after a while, things started to get weird. He compared himself to martyred religious figures, lost in strange delusions that may have been dreams. He lapsed in and out of sleep constantly, awoken by new pains or more aggressive symptoms. He started talking to Anneliese or Gilliman about things he'd said in dreams, and they'd look at him like a madman. After a while, Argrave just stared at the bronze hand mirror, clinging to it desperately and trying to imagine himself playing Heroes of Berendar again. A nice, cushioned seat beneath him. It was sad to long to play a video game when that world had become his reality. Perhaps he was beyond caring about how pathetic it was. If Anneliese and Gilliman had not been with him, he was certain he'd be dead. Though, perhaps that wasn't true. The alchemist would keep him alive, he suspected, but his price for doing so would be an arm and a leg. Perhaps literally. Amidst all the misery and shame from the entire experience, Argrave clung to something. It was a foolish thing to be proud of, he supposed, and he didn't think he'd ever tell anyone he'd been thinking about this at all. Throughout this whole endeavor, he never screamed. Not once. Thus far, it had been one hell of a challenge. Argrave might have shouted in anger, but he never screamed. It was a small victory in a battle with himself, but clinging to that kept him sane. He felt he had a goal beyond surviving, another thing to occupy his mind. With Anneliese present, she could conjure a ward and let him scream all he wanted, but this small, pointless victory brought him fulfillment. Despite the constancy of his situation, time flowed ever onwards. He knew this pain would not be eternal. He stopped asking how many days had passed. After a while, the alchemist would visit, examine, read Argrave's report, and occasionally ask bizarre questions. The questions were largely focused on Argrave, personality, ethics, not merely factual things as was typical coming from the monstrous man. It was strange, but then the alchemist himself was too strange to comprehend, and Argrave was a little too busy to contemplate deeply. Chapter 152, Standing proudly once more. Argrave blinked open his eyes as he stared at the blood-stained purple blanket before him, mind blank. It took a few seconds to realize he'd just woken up. And not in pain, too. The aching was there, still, but hollower. He was used to being woken up by spikes of pain, so it was a welcome feeling. He took the rare moment of respite to look around. After Gilliman had arrived, the place had become much cleaner. The vampire was absent, now, probably getting food. Anneliese slept peacefully on the couch. Argrave stared off into space for a few seconds, then was reminded that he had no time to rest. Argrave sat up, retrieving the book he'd been writing his reports on. Some blood had gotten on some pages, but such was life. If the alchemist gave him flack, he wasn't sure he'd care anymore. He wrote, passing the time, observing his own body. It wasn't his imagination. Though the dull aching was still present like boiling water beneath his skin, the spikes of pain were far less frequent, and infinitely less acute. Enough to sleep through, evidently. He was able to focus on the writing better than he ever had, he found. After a time, he judged there was nothing more to write. He tapped the writing instrument against his cheek, thinking, then set both the book and the tool down, satisfied with himself. The hunger still gnawed at his stomach, and he looked around. There was a platter of fruits. They looked like dragon fruits. They were too far to reach. He looked at Anneliese, then opened his mouth. He stopped, furrowing his brows. After a long while of indecision, he scooted quietly over to the bedside. He wreathed himself in the blanket to cover himself, then slowly rose to his feet. He supported himself cautiously at first, almost afraid to leave the bed, but then rose up, back rigid. He shuffled over, then retrieved one of the fruits. It had been peeled already, and as he ate it, he found it tasted all the sweeter than the day before. Feeling some joy for the first time in a long while, Argrave walked about the room, careful not to wake Anneliese. Walking brought him immeasurable joy. After a time, he spotted a pile of clothes. They'd been cleaned, he realized. He bent down and retrieved the simple underclothes he wore beneath his enchanted leather gear. Argrave watched Anneliese to be sure she was asleep, then quietly clothed himself once again. It made him want to cry. Strangely, he felt human again. Much of the deformities marring his skin had mostly faded, but he still felt the soreness as the clothes brushed against his skin. He tossed the blanket back on the bed, then let out a long, self-satisfied sigh. Anneliese stirred at the noise, and Argrave froze. When she lifted her head, locking eyes with him, he relaxed. No point in staying tense if he'd been caught. Argrave, she called out with a slight early morning slur, quickly moving to stand. What in the world are you doing? Preparing for an admonishment, he shrugged. Well. She stood up, laughing slightly. Then you know as well as I do that you should be back in bed. I've got better sores from laying there for so long. I need to move about, for my mental health if anything. Standing with my back straight on hard rock has never felt so satisfying before. Argrave looked down. You have no bed sores, Anneliese disagreed, striding up to him. She grabbed him by the shoulders. Come on, please, I need to walk about. Gonna go mental, Argrave pleaded. She stared at him for a bit, surveying him for damages. Her gaze finished wandering at his eyes, and she let out a long sigh. All right, I will come along. Hesitate none in asking for help if things get worse. Argrave beamed. I understand how a dog feels, now, feeling this excited for a simple walk. Argrave took steady steps towards the threshold. Take it slow, Anneliese called out exasperatedly, then quickly caught up to him. Argrave felt considerable trepidation, but he pressed onwards as though he didn't. It felt immeasurably satisfying seeing different sights once again, even if they were the same bleak obsidian walls all around. Despite feeling a boiling pain within, Argrave felt full of vitality. His steps were easy and quick, and he almost felt the urge to run. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this good, at least physically. Normally, he'd always feel heavy-stepped and fatigued at all times. Part of that was insomnia, most of that was his body. His old body, that was. Think I'll go and see where they pitched camp outside the place. Argrave spoke to Anneliese. Never thought I'd say this, but it'll be nice to talk to Garm again. It took a few seconds for Argrave to notice Anneliese had stopped. He paused, looking back. He said nothing, examining her. Her arms were crossed, and she stared at the ground. What is this? Argrave stepped towards her. He came to stand before her, and still she said nothing. Come on, spit it out. What did they do? He demanded. Argrave asked about them, not about me. Argrave shook his finger. Did Garm provoke the alchemist more? Is he that stupid? I have a hard time believing that. Argrave shook his head. She looked trouble, mulling over phrasing in her mind. Argrave tried to be patient, but soon enough that patience vanished. Where are they? Argrave questioned. Come on, where are they? There. He's here. She couldn't look up. Here? In the alchemist's place? Argrave confirmed, and when Anneliese nodded, he turned away, shaking his head. After letting out many obscenities, Argrave leaned up against the wall. His brain worked, trying to put together what might have happened. Then, as if in epiphany, he lifted his head up. In another second, Argrave took off, walking speedily down the hall. Argrave! Anneliese called out, chasing after him. Argrave wound through the complex palace of the alchemist, passing by and ignoring many rooms. Whether by pure dumb luck or accurate deduction, Argrave entered an open room, striding in and moving his head about. Durin had been laid across one of the tables. Argrave jogged towards him and grabbed his wrist. Firstly, he felt heat, assuaging some of his concerns. He looked around the room for Garm. He saw a large stack of white books, but, other than that, not a single sign. Argrave leaned in, studying Durin. He reached up and slapped his face, lightly, hoping to rouse him. No response. He heard footsteps behind him and turned round. What happened to him? He demanded. Anneliese walked closer, and said heavily, Durin will be asleep for some time. Yeah? And I assume this is no nap. Why? He demanded, trying to keep calm. Garm is. Annalise looked to the side. Garm decided to merge his soul with Darren's. Argrave stepped away from Darren, his mouth agape. He didn't know how to respond to that. His mind ran through old lore that he knew, conjuring things he knew of the matter. So there, Darren and Garm are. Argrave looked back at Darren. Annalise stepped to another table, then picked up a book. Beneath it was a letter. She handed it to Argrave. Garm wrote this for you, she explained. It's a. Argrave took the letter from her hands, staring at it. His face stayed still for a long while, staring down at that letter without action. His breathing started to get a bit faster. And then he ran for the door, heading for the distant light of the outside. Darren opened his eyes, seeing the blue sky above. He wiped at his face, trying to wake himself up. He felt the all-too-familiar feel of hot sand beneath him. Sometimes, heat could persist in the black sand of the burnt desert all through the night, especially during summer. But his thoughts caught up to him, and he quickly sat up, realizing the disconnect. He had expected to see endless sand dunes, but instead, he saw an endless field of black roses. His head darted around, taking in his surroundings in a half-panic. The terrain was split in half. On one side, a field of black roses. On the other, dunes of black sand, with wyverns flying all about the sky. He stood, utterly confused, head darting every which way. Then, he spotted a figure wearing red robes. This man sat on a large rock amidst the field of roses, looking down at Darren. Pretty sight, isn't it? The man questioned. Darren sized the man up. He wore luxurious red robes. The sleeves had a strange sewn pattern on them. They looked like a rose's thorns, and his shoulder pads were a rose's petals. The man's hair was brown, slightly wavy. He had a casual and cynical air to him, with bright blue eyes that made a handsome face sharper. You're half of this place. A little mediocre, honestly. I can't say I feel all too sorry for you, though. Darren stepped closer. He was starting to realize the voice was familiar. Garm? Sharp as a ball, I see. The man smiled. So that's what you used to look like, Darren realized. Before your run of bad luck. Garm spread his arms out. I was always all there. Inside, at least. Feast your eyes on a high wizard of the Order of the Rose, laid plainly before you. Darren said nothing, clicking his tongue as he watched. Your other look was eye-catching. Now, you're just a man. Always was, despite what happened. Garm spat, leaning back. Darren looked around, sizing up the place. Slowly, he shifted on his feet. You said that our souls would fight for dominance, he said carefully. This is our arena? Indeed. We stand amidst both of our souls, manifested completely. Garm nodded. Gods above. Darren looked about. You say soul fighting. I pictured two balls of light wrestling, not this. His eyes locked on something standing amidst the sand, a glaive, stabbed into the ground. Balls of light, PFFT. Still as ignorant as ever about the soul. Whose fault is that? Darren turned his head back. Mine. But it's not a fault, at least not from where I'm sitting. It's just an advantage. Now, obscuring information and giving half-truths are what I'm best at when I've only a brain and a mouth. And this place. Darren turned round, staring off into the distance. He could still see wyverns in the distance. The sand dunes seemed to move on endlessly, stretching out like an ocean in a starless sky. Darren could see figures dancing on the edge, vague and indistinguishable, yet simultaneously familiar. For some, it's a reflection of their personality. I'd say mine takes that side of the coin. For others, Garm pointed out, it resembles the place which embodies them most. A boring, dry, and hot desert. I suppose it is fitting, in a way. Darren snapped back to attention. The insult means less coming from you with the field black roses. What is that? Some kind of childhood fantasy? Darren pointed out. That's representation of your personality. Romantic like a rose, but black in the heart. Wilted, battered. Please, spare me. Garm let out a long, dry laugh, and slid down the rock he sat atop. Darren watched as he walked forward. I'm getting the inkling I should grab that glaive, Darren called out, stepping towards it. HMPH. Maybe you're a little sharper than a ball, Garm admitted. So, we're to fight? Darren questioned. No submission, give me the win. That was what we'd planned. Anyway, I told you our souls would fight, and that's the truth. I'm not a fan of suicide. Despite what I said, I told you my soul was damaged. Who's to say? Could be a lie, could be the truth. How would you know? We've established I'm a pathological liar. That I can't be trusted. Darren's jaw clenched. Was kind of expecting such a thing, frankly. You give off the vibe. Why'd you go through with it, then? Garm held his hands out. A whim. The alchemist wouldn't have gone through with this if you fed me lies. Argrave said that monster loathes deception. He'd correct you if you were wrong. I'm sure Argrave wasn't lying, at least, that means nothing has changed. A fair point, Garm conceded. So, then. Darren grabbed the glaive. One more thing to take care of. First, Garm held his hands up. No tricks. I know them all. Darren pulled free the glaive from the sand. So paranoid. Bastard after my own heart. Garm shook his head. Have it your way. Perhaps we can talk as we take care of things. Darren held the glaive at the ready. Garm stared back, blue eyes veritably gleaming. Chapter 153, last will. Garm knelt down and picked a black rose from the endless field. He held it up to his face, twirling it about with his fingers. The black petals began to twitch, and then exploded outwards as a mass of flesh. Opposite Garm, Darren panicked and jumped back at the unexpected sight. Garm could see his face morph with surprise, his sole desire becoming getting away. And the man did. He jumped back near 50 feet, practically flying in the sky. Garm had summoned some of his favorite creations, an order of the rose specialty, bats of flesh and skin, knives attached to their wings. Deadly, numerous creatures. Fighting was different when souls battled. This battle was a representation of something their minds could not comprehend. It was like living in a lucid dream. Will alone could conjure all manner of assaults, oddities. Garm had neglected to inform Darren of this. But the boy was sharp. He was sure things would be figured out quickly. Back when I was alive, I could make one of these bats with a single arm, Garm called out to Darren. Voices reached everywhere in this strange realm of the soul. Enough skin for the wings, enough bones for the important bits. I look forward to trying it out again with a different set of hands, this time. Keep looking forward, Darren called back, unbothered. Garm was surprised by his mental fortitude. He flailed about in the sky, falling. The boy was as sharp as Garm had expected, though. Wind around him swirled, then morphed into a giant grey wyvern, lifting him up into the sky. When we're finished with this, I'll be sure to enjoy it on your behalf, the tribal answered back, vigor, excitement, and fear marking his voice. As green as you are? It'll be some years before you come near my expertise, Garm refuted with a grin. He held his hand out, a spell matrix swirling. When it completed, wind billowed beneath his feet, and he burst upwards into the sky. That's why you'll lose. You're aged, Darren refuted, wyvern gliding about. Senile. Even not a chance for you. Tell me, then, Garm began, his bats rising up alongside him. What made you as you are? Cynical, bitter. This is a fight, not a spar. Darren cut him off, then threw his glaive at Garm. No time for talk. Fighting like this isn't as you think. Garm shook his head, then easily maneuvered around the glaive. It crashed to the sand below, spreading a black cloud of debris across the landscape. Talk doesn't distract. We're souls, now, not brains. The least we can do for the loser is carry on some memories. I'll remember you, to be sure, to prove my point. How about I break the ice? Garm sent forth his summoned bats with another spell, and the creatures frenzied to obey. They sought their target like a locust plague. Garm controlled them, talking all the while. Myself, I learned the world was a hellscape as soon as I was old enough to understand what hellscape means, Garm explained. Parents dropped me in the canals at Nordrhein. I clung to the walls, not 1 year old, or so I'm told. It was a long time ago, probably 700 years. Darren struggled to contest with the bats, casting impotent magic, killing one or two at a time. You've got me beat there, Darren admitted. In terms of tragedies, at the very least, my parents were decent. I was the last and 8th child. Darren's wyvern braced, and then spun about in an impossible manner, obliterating too many of the bats. Garm readied high-ranking electric magic. The knives stuck in the wyvern's flesh would attract it, making aiming easier. But you were the heir to the tribe? Garm questioned, sending a bolt of lightning as thick as a pillar forth. The wyvern howled as it struck its wing. Unless your tribe had some bizarre, meritorious succession, let me guess, they all died. Garm battered his opponent with powerful lightning magic, booms echoing out across the infinite landscape. Magic cost nothing but willpower, might as well use the expensive lightning magic, he figured. Darren stepped atop the snout of his wyvern, grasping its horn. He leapt from its maw, and the horn he held morphed into a glaive. In not half a second, he closed the vast distance between them with an inhuman jump. They died, yeah, putting it simply, Darren confirmed, then slashed at Garm. The High Wizard could only raise his arm up to receive the blow, reeling away a great distance. My uncle drove my older twin sisters to suicide. Don't know why, but I can guess. Guy was always a worthless creep. Without proof, without any testimony besides mine, the tribe left him unpunished. He was respected. They didn't know the details. So, he got off, scot-free. I didn't like that. Darren's glaive morphed back into a wyvern, and he pursued Garm. I found out, then, that if you want something, you have to make it happen. No one else will advocate for you. He continued, wyvern rushing down at Garm. You killed him? Good man, Garm complimented, then prepared a wave of wind to block the approaching pair. People that toy with kids, they're like rabid animals. The best thing to do for all parties, the animal included, is end them. Funny, Darren laughed as he approached. Garm sent out his wind magic, and the wyvern rider was knocked off the back, falling towards a field of roses. Some people would say the same of necromancers. Tell me, then, no parents, 1 year old. How do you live? On the streets, obviously, Garm answered. The streets of Nordrhein, they're rough, guardians of the low-way patrol about. These things, Garm explained, conjuring a spell matrix as he landed amidst his field of black roses. At once, several of the roses blossomed into the guardians of the low-way. Unlike those Argrave and his companions had seen, these had not degenerated. They looked solemn, encased in iron masks and bearing sharp weapons. It was a struggle to stay alive. But 1 year old, no matter how talented. Someone had to help you, Darren insisted, collapsing just opposite Garm amidst roses. He rose to his feet, glare-eye ready to meet the approaching guardians. Someone did help, Garm confirmed. A teenager helped me learn the streets, gave me some food. Then, when I was 8, he tried to sell me to some high wizard of the rose for experimentation. Idiot just got captured alongside me. No one misses street urchins, you see. Darren had a captivating, dance-like fighting style. He would cast magic with one hand, letting it hang in the air for a moment. Then he'd cut the spell with his glaive. The spell would wreathe around his blade, adding significant power to each of his attacks. How do you do that? Garm tilted his head, watching. Glaive's blade is woven bone, Darren explained as he dealt with the guardians. Magic is in their body. As such, spells can attach to the blade. I found out. It's a neat trick. He punctuated his explanation by throwing the glaive still wrapped in flames at Garm. Garm ducked, conjuring a wall of earth to be doubly safe. The glaive sunk deep into the earth, poking out the opposite side. Darren vaulted atop the wall, lunging at Garm. The High Wizard was prepared. He used blood magic, conjuring a bloody sword and thrusting in one swift motion. Darren twisted, barely avoiding being impaled, but the sword still grazed his abdomen. He landed atop Garm and forced him to the ground, then grabbed his hair, punching with his free hand. The blows hurt enough to remind Garm that he was alive, and that he still had a chance. Garm prepared a powerful spell, but Darren scrambled away, moving back behind the wall. Garm rose to his feet, walking backwards with blood trickling down his face. His injuries soon faded as his body reconstituted itself, another benefit of the realm of the soul. Since we're talking, I assume you didn't get experimented on by that High Wizard? Darren questioned. Wizards get arrogant, Garm explained. They don't really expect someone to hit them in the head. He wiped the blood off his face, noting the irony. I got the jump on him. He never expected an 8-year-old to know how to kill people, but on the streets of Nordrhein, you learn early. And you got away? Framed the kid who sold me, Garm said proudly, stalking around the earth wall. Darren was gone. Some of the guy's wizard friends came by to check on him later that day. I told them I was his hidden son, and that my would-be seller had killed him. Terrible lie, Darren admonished. It was a damned great lie. You had to be there. Garm turned his head to where the voice had come from. Just then, Darren lunged out. He conjured sparks, then swung his glaive. Garm ducked the lightning-wreathed attack, then tackled the man's knees. They both fell to the ground, and after a brief scuffle, Garm knelt atop Darren. Garm smiled, ready to return what he'd just been given. As a matter of fact, they inducted me into the Order of the Rose because of that lie, he disclosed, then punched Darren with one hand. The other prepared a spell. Darren retrieved his glaive and swung it. Garm had been prepared to grab the shaft, stopping it, but it morphed into a dagger mid-flight, cutting Garm's throat. With blood pouring out, Garm fell backwards, and Darren got some distance. Garm didn't neglect the spell he'd been preparing. This time, a great lance of wind as big as Darren himself surged out, catching the man in the torso. Darren flew backwards and collapsed. Silence set in as the both of them recovered from the devastating exchange. Garm was the first to sit up. Gods above. He rubbed his blood-stained, but healed, throat. You got far too good at this far too quickly. Darren struggled to sit up, his torso still slightly gored by the powerful spell. He glared at Garm, not with hatred, but with fierce competitiveness. Rest of your siblings, what happened? Garm questioned. Died in battle, Darren explained. They died against other tribals more than they did vessels. Can you believe that? We were pushed to near extinction, and still, they fought amongst themselves. Absolutely moronic. Darren rose to his feet, torso still a wreck. But they were family. Made the mistake of thinking I could do something good, for a change. Garm stood, brushing his clothes off and readying himself. Made that mistake once or twice, myself. It's why we're here, now. He laughed, then shook his head. Thought maybe I could do better by my son than I was done. His smile faded. But he was the one to kill me. My last student. My only child. He stared at Darren, true emotion coming through. Then, as if it was all a lie, that cynical grin returned. Only child I knew of, at least. Darren took a deep breath and exhaled. I think I get it. All this fighting, it's just pageantry. End of the day, it's like you said. This is just a battle of will. Garm nodded. That's right. Maybe my son wasn't my last student, after all. You should be honored. Garm fixed his robe. Unlike last time, there'll be no dying. Argrave sat by the great willow tree, staring out of the opening in the mountain they resided in at the edge of the world. An endless plain of skies waited beyond. He held Garm's letter in hand. He had read it countless times, but even now, it wasn't setting in. He started to read it again. Argrave, you might be furious. You might be feeling betrayed. You might be feeling saddened. Perhaps that last one is wishful thinking on my end. But, at the end of the day, this was my choice. Doing this was my only chance at real freedom. I know that you'll disagree. You probably would have done much and more to return me back as I was. But that's just the thing. I hate relying on others, and I hate being in debt. You seem a bad debtor. Moreover, Gulliman told me of his 10-year sentence to servitude. Don't rip up the page. I'm just joking. So, I concocted this little scheme. I'm sure Gilliman or someone else explained things to you, or maybe things have already finished, and one of us told you. Quite frankly, I don't know how this ends. Might be Dren walks out. I'd give him 99% odds. Might be I walk out. I'd give me 100% odds. You can see why I avoided gambling. Too much confidence in the unlikely. Regardless, I'm leaving this writing here as a contingency of sorts. To explain things, the alchemist graciously helped me write out all the spells I know. Just as Dren, you and Annalise are free to learn from the books. The more important matter, my eyes. I've had the alchemist remove my eyes. I suspect the eyes of an A-rank mage will be immeasurably useful to you, for reasons I doubt I need to explain. My ascension to A-rank made them different from others' eyes. 2. You can cast spells with them. The alchemist confirmed he would be willing to help you with that. It should work flawlessly. You and Annalise can decide who gets them. Gilliman has already refused. Of course, I promised the alchemist you'd do something for him. Ask him for the details. It's nothing big. In fact, you'd already intended to do it. I don't care for sappy stuff, but I wish to let you know I consider you a friend. See you soon, or never again. Garm, High Wizard of the Order of the Rose. Chapter 154, Cynical Bastards. Set aside this fight, for now. Let me ask you a question. Durin hefted his glaive, pointing it at Garm. Say you prevail. What next? I'll work at regaining the power I had. Garm answered at once. Durin lowered the glaive. You see, I've noticed a little problem you have. I asked that question, and you first talk about what you're going to do for yourself. I can't help anyone without power. Garm shook his head. That's why you're doing this. No, I offered you a route to power, and you lunged for the opportunity. The more I learn about you, the more I realize how your perception of me is flawed. There's a key difference between you and I. Durin settled back, sitting cross-legged amidst the field of black roses. And it's how far we are willing to take things. Garm raised a brow, and also sat down patiently. How so? Let's reflect on things. Durin raised his hand up. You deliberately withhold information whenever it suits you. You like constantly to get what you want. You don't care about how your actions bother people, nor about those you hurt. Moreover, Durin picked a black rose. These things you summon, they're made of human flesh. I can't just gloss over the fact that death is such a casual thing for you. Garm snorted. You're denouncing me as a bad person. You joined me in this deception. Don't get sore when you got caught in your own trap. You don't really care about other people. Durin held his gaze. That's the impression I get. Garm stared in silence, then raised a brow. Is that a bad thing? I do intend on helping Argrave, if that's your concern. I know what I've seen, Durin said flatly. And I've seen that when you want something, you'll do whatever it takes to make it yours. Person like that with power. Well, it's dangerous. Letting you roam free would be dangerous. If not for the present, for the future. Galactic Kit might be a supreme enemy. But what comes after, that's just as important. That was my mistake at Sethia. Garm scratched his cheek. A man can't change. My uncle was someone who did whatever he needed to get what he wanted, Durin said calmly. You yourself said people like him were like rabid animals, and that the best thing to do was put them down for themselves as much as everyone else. I said people that toy with kids are rabid animals. You're comparing me to your molest uncle? Garm veritably growled. Durin shook his head. I don't think you have that twisted inclination, number. But if you did, nothing would hold you back. You've got no conscience, no morals. Garm threw a dagger at Durin, and the tribal warrior quickly rolled to the side to dodge it. All this guilt I've been feeling, it's suddenly gone. Garm spat. Your life has been miserable, Durin continued as Garm rose to his feet, readying spells. I'll admit that. You've gotten plenty of life lessons that taught you to be as you are. In your situation, you had to take what you wanted, because no one was going to give it you. Garm conjured a whip of lightning and swung it at Durin. The tribal warrior caught it, shattering it with one hand. He stabbed his glaive into the earth and walked forward. Garm stepped backwards. With each step he took, the black roses unfurled into bats of flesh, flying towards Durin. It's how my people, the southern tribals, became as they were. Life in the desert is harsh, and so they learned how to take what they want by the blade. It worked well, for a time. They conquered the empire of the Southron elves. But eventually, they hit a wall, and they were eaten from within. Durin's hand liquefied. He was mimicking the power of a vessel in this lucid dreamlike state. Great spouts of water hunted each bat that came towards him, killing them relentlessly. Ahead, Garm used Argrave's favorite spell, and electric eels danced upwards into the air, forming a great cloud of sparking terror above. Thing is, a hard life is no excuse to trample on the lives of others, Durin continued. You're tough, tougher than me, probably. You're more ruthless, certainly. A cloud of near 100 electric eels shot downwards at Durin. He pulled an axe out of thin air, and swung it upwards. Garm only realized it was made of ebonite when everything he'd conjured dissipated, and sparks of lightning scattered across the vast expanse of land ineffectually. Durin lunged forth and grabbed Garm's neck. My brothers and sisters were all tougher than me, more ruthless than me, better embodiments of southern tribal traditions, by all rights. He held Garm there, squeezing tight. When I was the last living, my father said I was good enough. And that's just the thing. He continued, I am good enough. I can get the job done. And unlike you, I won't leave a wasteland in my wake. Like at Sethia? Garm smiled mockingly, barely resisting Garm's grasp. If you were Argrave, you would have sided with the vessels from the beginning. Durin pulled him closer. Am I wrong? And I would have been right. Garm shouted. Much less danger, much less sacrifice, less a battle, more a slaughter. But the vessels would have kept their grip over the burnt desert for time eternal. And my people would be dead. I owe Argrave. I haven't forgotten that. I hate this self-sacrificial bullshit you people engage in. Garm snarled. His body started to contort unnaturally, popping and breaking. He seemed to be shrinking. It's a damn shame. Work twice as hard to live half as much, he mocked. You grind your fingers to the bone building others' homes. Absolutely nauseating, Garm continued. At the end of the day, if you'd stop worrying about what's right and worry about what's good, you'd live twice as much and work half as long. That's your problem. Durin shook his head. You think living well and living right are mutually exclusive. For most people, the two are one in the same. Don't lie to yourself, Garm disagreed. His transformation had finished. Once again, he was but a head atop a stake. His eyes were missing. Now, you would be much happier if you lived as I do. I think you agree with me. Durin shook his head. And that's why you did this, because you've changed. But that's just it. You'll never know what's in my head. You'll never know my thoughts. Mutual understanding, that doesn't matter. Durin shook his head. We have mutual understanding. The same kindness you hate so much, Garm, is exactly what you wanted as a kid. Maybe we're alike in that way. But rather than becoming those who mistreated me, I'd much rather be their better. That way, the next generation can be spared of cynical bastards like us. Durin let the words hang, then thought of another example. Like your son. Stop talking. You're insufferable. Despite his harsh words, Garm's voice shook slightly. Durin was not sure if it was fear or something else, and he would never know. Glimmin sat near the incapacitated body of Durin. He was unsure of what, exactly, was going to happen. Matters of the soul, of death. Simply put, there was a reason Glimmin never studied magic. He was smart in many areas, but he had difficulty wrapping his head around things of a mystical nature. Ebonice suited him for this reason. He wasn't looking, but he could feel the body's heartbeat quicken, as though the person had just woken up. Glimmin knew, then, the battle was finished. He stood, walking over to the altar-like table where Durin rested. The eyes were closed. It's over, then, Glimmin said, though the person had given no indication they were actually awake. One eye opened, and a golden eye locked on Glimmin. Slowly, the man sat up. He looked at his hands like they were foreign objects. Who won? Glimmin asked tentatively. His head turned, and the two eyes started at Glimmin for a long while. Why? Did you make bets? Durin looked around. Given no one else is here, I'm guessing not. Garm's gone, then, Glimmin concluded, with so much certainty it was not a mere guess. Durin sighed. Yeah, that was. He shook his head, then stared off into the distance, as though there was much that he wanted to say. He was a good man. Durin lifted his head up. He tried to do what he thought was best. At the end, he lowered his head. I've learned from him, and, in a way, I'll continue to learn from him, for the rest of my life. Glimmin stared down Durin for a few seconds, scrutinizing him. Slowly, he nodded. Argrave knows about this. Earlier than intended. He improved a lot. Today, he went off into the jungle when he found out what had happened. Annalise followed. Durin ran his hands across his face. Damn it, I was hoping. He stood up off the table, rising to his feet. He swayed for a bit, then steadied. I should talk to them. Apologize, something. He started to walk, but Glimmin grabbed his shoulder. No, he stopped him. You shouldn't. Durin furrowed his brows, staring up at Glimmin. You really think so? I mean, even if it was Garm's idea, I still deceived them much more than they deserved. Not to mention, I've deprived them of someone. They will talk alone, Glimmin emphasized. Interrupting them now would be a great disservice. Durin nodded. If you think that's best. He shook his head. Might be I'm hated for this. Might be, Glimmin shrugged, taking his hand off Durin's shoulder. How reassuring, Durin noted sarcastically. You made your choice. I'll offer no empty comforts, Glimmin declared. But you made your vow, too. As long as you hold it. As long as you help. I cannot imagine they will remain frigid towards you. But bear this in mind. Glimmin stepped closer, looming over Durin. When you take a life for the sake of duty, I expect that duty to become your single-minded focus. I'll do more than my part, Durin agreed, nodding. Garm gave his life for mine. I will never forget that. Durin stepped away, leaning against the table. Thinking of something, he questioned. What do your people say of Girektik Kiat? Much, Glimmin declared simply. Then it's about time I get to work. No? Educate me. Please. Chapter 155, Stupid Heart. Argrave, Annalise called out, short of breath. Argrave turned his head from where he sat beside the great willow tree hanging off the ledge. This was where the cave housing the alchemist's home ended, leaving only a sheer cliff at a high point in a mountain. With the unending plain of clouds ahead, it appeared like the end of the earth stretched before him. The suns were setting, hueing the white fluffy clouds with reds and oranges. Annalise took some time to catch her breath, and then took slow steps towards him. Argrave turned his head back to the view before him, watching silently. She came to stand beside him. "I feel blindsided," he said, gaze wandering the cloud steps. "Always had a theory about suicide. I thought there were some types of people that just wouldn't. No matter how rough, they never do something like that." He exhaled through his nose lightly, the smallest laugh. "I thought Garm was one of those types." He brought his knees up and wrapped his arms around them. "Thought I was, too. That's something to note." He paused. "Don't worry, I'm not suggesting anything." Annalise shifted on her feet. "It was not suicide." "Exactly," she argued as she sat down beside Argrave, staring out. "I know a fair bit about souls. Read a lot of lore about them." Garm mused, voice of the corrupt. The damage to his soul would be significant. "What's more, Duran's got an iron will." Argrave shook his head. "It was hopeless from the beginning." Garm must have known that. But Garm was arrogant, she pointed out, staring beyond. "Maybe he genuinely thought he could win." He shook his head deliberately and slowly. "I can't believe that." Garm might have had more experience. But in a fight between souls, that really matters none. You can do one such fight in Heroes of Berenda. It's a fancy fight. But given what I know of the law, if one soul is damaged, it's like pitting a bear against a dragon. The bear might be dangerous, but, she sighed, of all people, Garm. She looked at him. "We knew him less than a month. And though it is horrible to say, I do hope Garm lives. But even still. Argrave pressed. He was deeply unhappy. Miserable. Maybe he jumped at the first chance he saw. No matter how poor his odds were, she mused. Anything to avoid living as he was for a while longer. Argrave said nothing, considering his own position on the matter. He knew Duran better than her, even if it was in a different medium. But, in this reality, he'd known Garm for longer. The man had been obstinate, stubborn, but there was a strange charm to his constant bitterness. He was like Ro, in a way. Ultimately, Argrave sighed. "I just want this day to end." Annalise stared at Argrave, watching him. A silence settled in between them for a long while. "Argrave, please, break this cycle." He turned his head. "What are you talking about?" "Holding your thoughts inside. Losing yourself in other things until you forget about it. Every time you get like this, it is worse than the last. Then your nightmares get worse, and you keep burdening yourself more and more and more." Annalise shook her head, unruly white hair swaying. His grey eyes stared her down, steady as stone. After a time, he turned back to the view. The suns were setting lower, adding shades of purple and pink atop the clouds. "Ignoring these things is a good skill to have, for a guy in my position." He shrugged, seemingly nonchalant. "I can't let thoughts, emotions, distract from the ultimate goal." "Again, you hesitate to speak." She shook her head frustratedly. "That stuff isn't easy for me." He ground his feet against the ground. "Not to mention my current in agony state." "Agony makes people more emotional, typically, yet even now you choke yourself." She sidled closer. "Please." She stared at him intently. "Please, what?" Argrave looked to her. "Stop choking yourself." "And do what? Spill my guts?" Argrave threw his hands up. "What's the point?" "I'm positive you know what I'm feeling, but not why," she insisted. "That is the crux of things. There is only so much I can deduce from what I notice. There is so much you keep hidden, private." She pointed at him. "You refuse to disclose even the simplest things. Your name." "Argrave," he rebuked. "You know what I mean. Acting ignorant does not become you." Annalise gave him a stern-eyed glare. "The name of who you were before?" she elaborated. "Why is that important?" He held out his hands. "I'm here, now. That life is gone. That guy is dead." "Is he?" she questioned loudly. "I talk to him right now." I grow frustrated at his obstinance. I worry for his well-being when he runs out, barefoot, into a jungle when he was sweating blood and having seizures not yesterday. Argrave stared at her, eyes wide when the ever-calm Annalise yelled. After a time, he found the situation rather funny. He turned his head and laughed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to run out." "I got a little overwhelmed when I heard the news." "Yet you will not say why," she noted, annoyed. "Why is that important?" "In case you have not noticed, I am always fascinated by why," she pointed out, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. Argrave rocked with her pushes, then chuckled, much of the tension dispelled. "I feel pretty good, actually. The aching, it's lessening. And that run, by God, you wouldn't even recognize me." He held up his hand. "My nails are even growing back. I think things are getting better, even if I'm not out of the water." "I am glad of it." "Hopefully, things will." She stopped, then frowned. "You are too good at controlling the conversation." "I will not drop this subject." He laughed again. "I'm caught." "Argrave, I insist on this because I am worried," she said levelly. "You act exactly like Garm." Argrave turned his head quickly, almost offended. "What did he do?" "He lied and tricked us all." "It may have been for a good purpose, but at the end of the day, he is lost to us." She pointed at Argrave. "Just because it is in a different manner does not change the fact that you are doing the same thing." "Self-sacrifice." Argrave frowned. "I can't recall the last time I tricked you," he pointed out. "And all that Garm did was withhold information." She poked his arm as she said those last two words. "Does that sound familiar?" "No," he lied, adjusting his sitting position. Annalise stared at him patiently, waiting for him to speak. "All right," he nodded. "I do understand your point." "I'm not conceding that you're right," he added. "As I recall, you once said I was smarter than you, and you would never refuse my advice." She smiled sweetly. Argrave frowned but couldn't hold the expression for long before he broke off into a chuckle. "People always turn your own words against you in the end." "Do you trust me?" she questioned. "Of course," Argrave answered at once. "That isn't what this is about." "Never was." "I think that you do distrust me," Annalise refuted. "Ridiculous." Argrave shook his head quickly. "Honestly, after what happened today, Guilliman, Darren, and Garm going behind our backs like that, I think I trust you the most of everyone." "Then why do you keep me at a distance?" "Even still, it's precisely because I trust you so much." Argrave looked at her insistently. "Of everyone." "Hell, I said it earlier this month. I don't want you to think less of me." "I said it, plainly. The idea makes me very uncomfortable. The mundane nonsense that worms its way into my head. If I tell you that, Christ, I'd die of embarrassment." "You do not trust I would treat you the same if I knew more about you," Annalise summarized, tone flat. "No," Argrave insisted, holding his hand out. But his visceral reaction faded, and he truly processed what she said. His face turned pensive, and his hand lowered. "You see, now?" She raised a brow. Argrave could only turn his head away, with nothing more to argue against. Ahead, the field of clouds had been dyed beautiful colors by the setting sun. It was like a painting, so beautiful it was, the dangling leaves of the willow tree only adding to the beauty. "Why would you accept me if you knew me?" he finally spoke, voice quiet. "Argrave, royal bastard of House Vasker, powerful mage blessed by Earl of vanguard against Girektik Kiet. And behind that, there's just some fucking guy." He shook his head. "Some strange goblin creature who locked himself in his home, writing about a game for fun." "How do the two compare at all?" "Argrave, all of this, all of me, everything I've done, it's with someone else's body." He turned his head to her. "That gnaws at me, every day. I'm an imposter, a phony. I'm wearing someone else's shoes, and I'm walking about like my feet are massive." "My feet are small, I'm just wearing big shoes, Annalise. My hair, my eyes, my voice, even my skin's an adornment." He whipped his head back to the skyscape, blinking quickly. Annalise crawled forward a little and grabbed Argrave's shoulders, turning him around. "Argrave," she said insistently, staring him in the eyes. "When you were born, did you choose your appearance?" "What?" he questioned, confused. "In your previous life, did you choose how you look? Did you choose your parents? Did you choose your social status or financial status, your physique, your intelligence, your talents? Did you choose your name?" Argrave wiped at his eyes, refocusing. "Well, no, but I could have chosen the last." "No," she repeated, giving him a light shake. "You chose none of that." "But I grew into it," he insisted. "I was born, I grew, I had parents, I had a life. Now all of that is gone, and I'm in this slowly spoiling world with a responsibility so heavy." "You have no responsibility," Annalise declared. He hesitated a beat, then continued, "But the bronze hand mirror, everything you have done, you have chosen to do." She took a deep breath and sighed. "Responsibilities are things fabricated by the mind, by society. You have no responsibility to do anything about anything. This was your choice." Argrave stared at her amber eyes, throat tight and breathing heavy. "I have never known Argrave." Annalise shook her head. "I have known you. I know the man who chose to throw himself headlong into unimaginable danger with not an ounce of hesitation. Your first response to your situation was to endeavor to stop an invasion," she said plainly, "despite your sickly body, and despite your weakness. And you succeeded. From there," she continued, still holding his shoulders, "you braved a cavern full of horrifying bugs. You navigated that city of just like it was your own property and negotiated a pivotal alliance between nobles. By the end of it all, you went into the low way, getting caught between vampires, a knightly order, and twisted abominations, and emerged on top. You spurred a revolution against a tyrannical cult. And now, you have become black-blooded. I don't say this to flatter you, I say it to emphasize your choices, your actions." Argrave's breathing calmed a fair bit. "Well, each had varying degrees of success. And I wasn't alone." "You were the impetus," she insisted. He raised a brow, then conceded with a shrug. "I guess that was not Argrave. That was you. And I know you. You used to hate getting dirty or touching people, but you overcame that. Your response to discomfort or nervousness is to make jokes. I knows that you enjoy explaining things, and I knows that you enjoy learning magic. I know that you care deeply for the people around you. Indeed, all people. You are a man who deceives everyone, most of all himself. You are a prolific liar, astonishingly so. Truly, it is almost unnerving how quickly you can fabricate things." His growing smile paused. She leaned in a little closer. "I do not know Argrave, but I know you. I like your witty comments and your humorous interjections. I am constantly astonished by your diligence and your willpower. You are admirably tenacious. The tenacity you have displayed these past days, it is unfathomable." She shook his shoulders. "This is you. All of it. You are the tall, confident, handsome man I know. who calls himself Argrave. Annalise's words rattled his cage, bringing up something Argrave had been trying to keep locked away. He felt unbearably nervous as he lifted his hand up to her face. His fingers brushed her cheek, and she took a deep breath of surprise. She didn't pull away, though, and he stared into her beautiful amber eyes. He leaned in, slowly, heart pounding the fastest it ever had. Their lips met, and they shared a kiss. Beyond them, the suns continued the set, painting a serene scene of purples, oranges, pinks, and blues across the ocean of clouds. Argrave pulled away and rested his forehead against hers, staring into her eyes. Both of them had red cheeks. "I've wanted to do that for a long while," he admitted quietly. Annalise stared back into his eyes. It felt like the two of them had entered their own private little world, and everything around had ceased to be. Sounds, sights, smells, pain, all gone. There was only the two of them. "I know," she said after that long moment. Argrave lowered his head to her shoulder, laughing heartily. Annalise soon joined him, both falling into a disorganized heap of giggles. All the tension, sadness, anger, dispelled at once, and they both held each other. By the end of things, they laid on their backs, staring upwards. "Definitely could have chosen a better time for that," Argrave commented. "I bet I look terrible." "I thought you were not attracted to me," Annalise admitted quietly. "What?" Argrave sat up quickly, supporting himself with his elbow and staring down at her. "Why would you ever think that? I would notice, I suppose." She shook her head. "Romantic feelings, but then they would vanish, like you were disgusted by them." Argrave frowned. "Not disgusted, never. Just, I didn't think it would be a good time for such a thing. And, she pressed, raising her hand to his face. "I felt I was inadequate." He looked off to the side. "Well, correct that, feel." She sighed. "Need I give you yet another monologue?" Argrave laughed, then turned back to face her. "Look at you. You're drop-dead gorgeous. You're probably the most talented spellcaster in the world. You're way smarter than I am. I don't think anyone could be a worthy partner for you." She smiled, cheeks reddening. "You are." She pinched his cheek. "You nameless man. Will you tell me your name, now?" "Payment for the kiss?" he questioned playfully. "That would be an unfair barter." She shook her head. He grinned. "You're right. Kiss from you, that's worth the world." "No," she laughed. "I get both a kiss and a name." "That's too much for me." Argrave laid back on the ground, joining her in laughter. "My lord, can't believe you think you're not smooth." She held her hand out. Argrave took it. "Vincenzo, Vincent," he said. She leaned up. "Vincenzo Vincent?" "No," he snorted. "Vincent's a shorthand." "Vincent, Vince, Vinny, Van. Take your pick." "Vincenzo Giordano." "That's my name. I'm an Italian-American. Though you don't really know what that means, and my parents were the black sheep and didn't care much about heritage, anyhow. Don't even have the accent." "Vincenzo Giordano," she repeated slowly, and then squeezed his hand a bit tighter. Argrave felt strange, hearing that name again after so long. It wasn't entirely pleasant, but it wasn't unpleasant, either. "Would you like me to call you that when alone, or?" She trailed off, staring at him. "No," Argrave shook his head. "Argrave isn't bad. I don't hate it. And frankly, hearing that name again does make me a bit uncomfortable. Reminds me of things. I'd rather just treat Argrave as my new name." "If it makes you uncomfortable, forget it." She shook her head, and then laid back down. A quiet silence set over them as they laid there. The suns had vanished, now, leaving only night behind. "If you want me to open up a little. Honestly, the only thing that kept me going was discipline." Argrave held her hand a little tighter. "Getting up was the hardest part of each day. Maybe that's why it was hard to sleep." "I hope you say was because that has changed." "For the sleeping part, I suppose we'll have to find out." "But," Argrave trailed off, "my health is going to better." "Stella, hell, this little moment we're sharing, it's easy to ignore the pain." "I'm black-blooded, a monument to health and wealth." He thought of something and laughed. "What?" Annalise asked, confused why he was laughing. "I thought the best gift I'd get here was becoming black-blooded. Turns out I was wrong again. Instead, I got you." She shook her head, but Argrave could hear very faint laughter. After a while, she sat up. "Argrave," she began, freeing her hand and placing it on her lap. "Yeah?" He adjusted his head. "When this is all is over, do you want to find out why you came here? What happened to you?" Argrave raised a brow, then lost himself in thought. "The way things are shaping up," Argrave began, "there's going to be a lot of devastation, between the plague, the civil war. Most of all, Gerektigkeit. And those are just the ones most immediately obvious." Argrave shook his head. "If I have a large part in things, as is almost necessary, it stands to reason I'll need to be a part of the rebuilding, too." "A position of prominence," Annalise noted. "Leadership, guidance, perhaps even sovereignty." Argrave went silent. He stared up at the stars, just barely visible beyond the ceiling of the cave. "The thought had entered my head," he noted. "Royal bastard, heavily involved, hopefully a force for good. Maybe people might want that as a king. But bastardry is a heavier stain than you might imagine." "I'm not suggesting you take it," Annalise shook her head. "The opposite. In fact, you'll have toiled for 3 years, sweating blood. Quite literally, after this month, she noted. Once he who would judge the gods is gone. Maybe we can abandon it all. Already planning an elopement? Argrave smirked. Be serious, she insisted, grabbing his hand and shaking it. I see how much you put into this. I said it earlier, but you are astonishingly resilient. Some selfishness would be long overdue once things are over. You're planning for something we've yet to do, Argrave pointed out. The odds are far from being rigged in our favor. Fighting a world killer, not exactly a guaranteed win, little lady. He gripped her hand. There's something selfish I do want to do, though. And what is that? Make the whole world know about us, he suggested. We have an opportunity to become really unbearable, and I think it needs to happen. She smiled. Unbearable? She repeated. You know the type. Constantly being lovey-dovey, no matter where. He smiled, then shook his head. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, imposing my thoughts like this. I'm happy, and I feel lucky. Me too, she nodded. But a position of prominence, as I mentioned already, Nicoletta's father wished to engage you to. Stop that, Argrave interjected at once. If there's one thing I'm not willing to compromise on, it's you. No political nonsense is going to stop that. She said nothing in response, but she did smile. Argrave looked back towards the stars. I think I'm looking forward to the future, Argrave realized. Argrave, please do not become like Garm, Annalise insisted. Those words felt like Argrave had been pushed back into reality. He felt guilty he had been able to put that aside so quickly. But the mind avoids the negative. His mind more than most. The idea of it makes me nauseous, she continued. Do not sacrifice yourself for anyone, and if not with anyone else, at least promise to be totally honest with me. The two of them stared at each other. Argrave stayed silent. He found it was a difficult promise to make. There was much he wished to hide from her, much he wished to never again let see the light of day. All right, Argrave nodded, though the words were difficult to say. I promise, contended. She laid down, resting her head on his chest. Argrave wrapped one arm around her, feeling full of life. Cupid heart, stupid heart. Where will you go from here? Chapter 156, No Return Policy. Argrave and Annalise talked for a long while before Argrave's hunger started to eat at him, and they elected to return. On the way back, Argrave's Bromosines greeted him, climbing all over him like a friend sorely missed. Argrave could almost feel their worry for him. Their fur was growing shades darker. It seemed they had food enough to live well in this place. It was a testament to the alchemist's callous nature, he supposed. It also served as a reminder not to step out of line. But after a time, Argrave left them outside once more, entering into the alchemist's home alongside Annalise. As they walked through the halls of the alchemist's home, faint voices echoed through the halls. They cast a glance at each other, and then Argrave rushed towards its source. Argrave turned the corner to where Duran's body had been resting. Glimmer was looking at him, evidently hearing his approach long ago. Duran, or was it Garm? Twisted his head to look at Argrave. Argrave, Glimmer greeted. Without words, Argrave stepped up to the other person in the room. A pair of golden eyes watched him, the purple light of the alchemist's abode reflecting off the golden tattoos on his skin. He stared for a long while. Eventually, Duran took a deep breath. Garm is gone, he disclosed. The words hit harder than Argrave thought they would. Perhaps he hadn't accepted it. Perhaps he was holding on to the belief that some strange miracle would happen. But now, seeing Duran standing, it was like he'd seen the body in the coffin. I am sorry for deceiving you, Duran continued, looking at Argrave. His gaze shifted to Annalise as she entered. For deceiving all of you. But what happened? It was something I strongly feel needed to happen. And Garm wanted this. At that moment, Argrave recalled something his father had told him once. He turned his body slightly to the side. Then he rotated again, throwing a punch as though something was behind Duran. His middle knuckle struck the man right in the nose. Take a stance, rotate your hips, keep your wrist straight, and punch right through him, his dad had insisted. Maybe his dad was right, or maybe he was lucky. Regardless, Duran's head jerked back and his knees buckled, and he stumbled backwards before falling against the ground. Argrave stood there, still tense. That was the first time he had ever punched anyone. Duran wasn't small, by any means, well-built, tall for normal-sized people, but Argrave had downed him. His hand hurt, but he felt a strange rush of relief. He heard Annalise gasp, and even Gilliman looked a little surprised. Argrave stepped forward. Duran already regained his bearings. He scrambled upwards, ready to fight. Argrave only pointed. Don't ever pull anything like that again, Argrave declared. Duran rose to his feet, one hand on his bleeding nose. His wide eyes stayed locked on Argrave for a long time, and then he nodded. I don't want to see you for a while. Argrave lowered his hand. We'll talk when I've got a cool head. Right now, I'm feeling like doing something we'll both regret. All right, Duran answered, voice nasally. Argrave turned and left, storming down the hall. Annalise quickly moved after him. Once they were a decent distance away, Argrave asked, why did I do that? Because you were angry, Annalise answered. I already regret it. Argrave shook his head. God damn it all. I can't be doing stupid things like that. He's supposed to be another member of our group. It may be good thing, she mused. Argrave paused. In the halls, turning. How? He may feel that he has been punished for what he has done. Subliminally. If this can be overcome, he would see you as a leader more naturally. After all, a leader needs to deliver punishment. He stared with a frown for a while, and then began walking back to his room once again. Once he passed the threshold to his room, he paused in his tracks, spotting the great alchemist looming overhead. Refrain from that wandering again, he commanded at once, holding Argrave's report in his hand. I do not need unnecessary variables in my observation. He closed the book, then turned his head. Regardless, your writing has regained some clarity. I expect you to describe how your body felt during that foolish outing. Argrave nodded slowly, feeling unsettled, tense, and angry. The second he wanted to hold Annalise's hand, she was already doing so. He found out her empathic abilities were nicer every day, it seemed. Garm said that he promised I would do something for you. Argrave spoke. What was it? Annalise looked at him, evidently ignorant of this promise. You will stop Kiet, the alchemist said plainly. At any cost. Argrave took a deep breath, almost finding the promise funny. Annalise had said he had chosen to fight Kiet, that it wasn't a responsibility, yet now, he was making a promise to do so. Yes, I will. Argrave nodded. If the alchemist had a reaction to the vow, he displayed none. He held his hand out. His finger unfurled, revealing a set of black eyes with golden irises. Argrave flinched a little. Eyes made him uncomfortable. Who receives these? The head was not clear. Argrave stared at them, greatly disturbed. That was the saddest part of all, by his estimation. His throat tightened, and Argrave swallowed to dispel the feeling. The eyes seemed to have some intangible magic swirling about them, barely perceptible. Can I think about it? Can you think about it? The alchemist repeated. You query me seeking answers regarding something only you can answer. Do I have control of your faculties? I replaced your heart, not your brain, and even then both are yours alone. I need time to think. Argrave rephrased, feeling exhausted. The alchemist's fingers popped as they curled, hiding away the two black eyes. He walked away without giving a confirmation, leaving Argrave even more battered. I think that's his way of saying yes. Argrave sighed, releasing Annalise's hand. He strode to his bed, recalling only now how filthy the place was. Annalise walked up, and perhaps noticing his disgust, pulled off the blankets. I will replace these, she stated. No, Argrave stopped her. Let's sit for a minute. She held the blankets, frozen, then nodded. They both sat. Garm's eyes, Argrave said, shaking his head. Christ, what a blow. They would be helpful, Annalise conceded. He wrote a letter to me, too. He described them. Apparently, they'll function as any other A-rank mage's eyes, retaining their ability to perceive another's magic, and moreover, you can cast spells from them. Argrave nodded. He wrote the same to me. He turned his head over to her, a bit morbid, inheriting someone's eyes. Since you remembered, can I take it that you, Argrave? She looked down. I am not entirely sure I can. He saw a chill run through her. The idea of subjecting myself to the alchemist makes me afraid. Argrave nodded. Then put the idea out of your head. A good thing, too, he noted, putting his hand to her cheek. Elsewise I'd never be able to see those beautiful amber eyes again, he said, trying to distract her with a compliment. It seemed to work, and Annalise regained some vigor. Argrave fell back to the bed, thinking on the matter. He pondered his eyes, then started to laugh. First time black-blooded, now I've got golden eyes with black sclera. Can't get much edgier than that. What's next, I wonder? Cursed harm? Third eye? Annalise looked down at him. I get the impression you do not want them. Argrave bit at his lip. I stand out enough as is. With eyes like that, covert operations are. Well, hell. Covert operations were never on the table. I stick out way too much. Argrave shook his head. People might distrust me, might think I'm possessed, or inhuman, who knows? Annalise watched him. You feel conflicted. Talk to me, she reminded him. I don't know. Argrave trailed off. Would feel very, very wrong to refuse them. A man donates his organs to me. I toss them out because they're the wrong color. Talk about desecrating the dead, spitting on a last wish. Argrave shook his head. Why not present them to Dran? Annalise suggested. Argrave looked at her. Garm never mentioned Dran, he pointed out. And I don't know. He's very free-spirited. I'm not sure if. Well, he trailed off, but Annalise nodded understandingly. N0vlisp.c0m. Do you recall Helmut? Annalise questioned. The man had eyes like purple vortexes, as I recall. Argrave leaned up quickly, clarity coming to him as soon as she posed the question. Yeah, you're right, he nodded. I can just say it's because I'm a spellcaster. Hand wave things away, call it magic. Indeed, she nodded. It will certainly take some getting used to, nonetheless. Yeah, I can't even imagine what it's like, perceiving magic. Argrave shook his head. Honestly, now that I think about it, a little exciting. Honestly, I referred to my own adaptation. She shook her head. I fear I will recall Garm when I look at you. Look on the bright side, he said cheerily. These weren't my eyes to begin with. She was taken off guard and laughed. One way to look at things. You will have them? The alchemist questioned. Annoying. Argrave frowned. but had regained his bearings and did not so easily ask questions as he had in days past. He didn't care to push his luck. The alchemist stepped around Argrave's bed. A day had passed, and the place had become much cleaner. The couch that Annalise had been sleeping on had been moved away. She didn't need to sleep there anymore. Although Argrave wasn't sure either of them were ready to do more than actually sleeping, he had been concerned he might thrash in his sleep and disturb her, but their night was peaceful. I will not suffer yet more variables to disrupt my observation of your body. I will implant the eyes when the process is done. Meaning I must preserve them until that time. A taxing, laborious task. Annoying, he repeated. Argrave said nothing, lowering his head. The worst of your metamorphosis is over, declared the alchemist. You may thank the blood of Vaska flowing within you. Feathered serpents have magic in their blood innately. In other such bloodlines it manifests as a high affinity for magic, generally. Here, it made your transition faster, easier. It seems something to note for the future. It may be a correlation, not a causation. The alchemist shook his head. Unfortunately, I can conduct no more tests. Argrave brightened at the alchemist's words, then paled when he realized what he'd been through was faster, and easier. If he had not been a Vaska, what would things have been like, he wondered. I think you will fail against Girektik Kiat, the alchemist said. But everyone you brought is very confident in you. The words were unexpected. Frankly, Argrave wouldn't have believed they came from the alchemist had he not seen the man's mouth rise and fall and voice them. I don't think I will. Argrave shook his head. But that's why I have to use my words. Make others aware, get them to finish things for me just in case. It's my specialty. Argrave smiled. The calamity changes every millennium, the alchemist said. I know. Argrave nodded. It's changed greatly from last time. It's sowing dissent, targeting leadership, my family being the primary examples. Girektik Kiat plays the puppet master. It's using us for its own end. Has been for years, now. The alchemist turned away. Then it learned. And just as we won't fight it alone. It won't fight us alone, Argrave stated seriously. When the time comes, I will ask you to help us. The alchemist put his hands behind his back, staring down at Argrave. Maybe it was a delusion, but the ivory-skinned monstrosity seemed there. Chapter 157, All eyes ahead. Argrave laid his head back against the pillow, blinking rapidly. The alchemist's finger curled inwards, stashing away the unsullied knife. Eye replacement surgery had to be one of the most unpleasant operations imaginable, doubly so because the alchemist was an unfeeling bastard who made him stay awake for the entire process. Even if it was painless, being blinded temporarily was terrifying beyond compare. The alchemist didn't have the grace to replace each eyeball individually. Instead, he took both of them out, then replaced them one after the other. The only thing comparably horrifying was confronting death when he'd bonded with the Brummersinners, or perhaps the other thing the alchemist had done to him. It is done, the alchemist concluded. This change will not be inherited by your progeny. Unlike the black-blooded transformation. My eyes feel hot. Argrave rubbed at them. It should be agonizing. Perhaps you are numb to pain, the alchemist concluded. The black blood must integrate with these eyes. In time, they will heal. The color is brought about by necrotic decay coupled with necromancy. With your body as the template, you will regain your eye color. Half a year, according to my estimates. Surprised and somewhat relieved to hear his eyes wouldn't remain like this forever, Argrave dared to open his eyes. And at once, saw for himself just how absolutely powerful the alchemist was. He could see the magic practically bursting from his skin like a black cloud of death within him. It felt like looking at the sun, and Argrave quickly turned away. He spotted Annalise. She had magic within her, too, permeating throughout. Though it was the same black mist, it was nowhere near as dense as the alchemist's. He was worried that this change would be eternal. But as soon as he wished for it, the black mist faded into oblivion like it never was. I can see magic with will alone, Argrave noted, finally starting to feel things were worth it. Argrave had yet to breach B-rank magic, and A rank was even further beyond his ken. He had something special in mind for the ascension to A rank. The increase in power at that point would be comparable to his black blood. Yet for now, the ability to discern magic power would be immeasurably useful. Doubly so now that they were to head back into Vaska, and once again confront mages. His vision felt clear, too. Maybe he was delusional, but he felt like he saw things in better detail. Garm hadn't been falsely bragging about having good eyesight, evidently. If you lose them, I will not heal you, the alchemist finally said, acting like losing eyes was as inconsequential as losing a ring. Our business is done. Begone. Leave no messes. Argrave watched the alchemist leave, then fell back into the bed, acutely aware of his eyes. He turned to Annalise. How bad is it? He questioned. She stared at his face. Compared to your first 2 weeks incapacitated, it does not look bad at all. Bloodshot, perhaps. No, I mean, how does it look? He rephrased. Unsettling, Annalise finally said. A little. She softened the blow. Argrave sighed. Half a year like this, allegedly, might be helpful some places, might cause trouble in others. I'll have to look for myself. He reached for the bronze hand mirror, hefting it up as though to look for a change. Traits, tall, black-blooded, intelligent, magic of inity, high, insomniac, blessing of supersession, max, skills, elemental magic, C, blood magic, C, healing magic, C, illusion magic, C, warding magic, C, druidic magic, C, inscription, E, imbuing, E. Argrave hadn't been idle. He'd been saddled with a massive magic debt to Erlebn after the raid on Argent and the battle with the Lord of Silver. Every single day, he paid close attention to how much magic he had, diligently repaying things. It took perhaps 3 weeks to fully repay the debt. The rate was utterly ridiculous. His magic regenerated so much faster than before. You think Garm left behind some good blood magic? Argrave questioned Annalise. None of it is good. It hurts you. Do not use it. Annalise crossed her arms and shook her head. Argrave got up out of the bed, squeezing his eyes shut even still. Black blood has an amazing synchronism with blood magic. I'll heal quicker from any damage, too. I have to use it. Annalise looked off to the side, obviously miffed and concerned. I'll look for myself. Argrave shook his head. Hold on, she stopped him. The alchemist said we needed to leave no mess. Argrave looked around at the room. Despite Guilliman pitching in, the place was a mess. The room had been mostly black before, but now Argrave found it a toss-up between red and black. Cleaning this up would be a painful endeavor. Blood doesn't come up easily. Christ, Argrave muttered. At least there's no carpet. Argrave stepped outside the gargantuan bulging door of the alchemist's palace. The man hadn't come to see them off, and it felt strange to leave without a single word to their host. But their host was weird, and the term host only applied because of the stringent requirements. Once again, Argrave was fully ready. He wore his black enchanted leather armor, the matching duster over top it. It was a little less loose than it had been before, like he had grown larger. His brimosners rushed out from the jungle, and he knelt down to retrieve them. Annalise's own fox creature followed just shortly after, running into the palace. Argrave stood up, stroking the giant ears of his sorely missed pets. The road ahead made Argrave feel strangely nervous. Annalise walked up behind him, and he looked back. I laid in bed for a month. But I really want a break, Argrave said quietly, offering his hand. She took it. Take one, then, she suggested. He looked sorely tempted, but after a while, he turned his head back to the road. I've got one thing I wanted really bad. Argrave clenched her hand a bit tighter. That'll have to tide me over for the next few years. With that, Argrave released her hand and stepped forward. They walked past the jungle until it thinned, opening up into a clearing. There, Durin Reed, leaning up against a tree. Guilliman stood there, arms crossed, ready for their approach. Leaving? Guilliman said simply. Yeah, Argrave confirmed. There was an awkward air between them. I'll pack. Guilliman stepped away. Durin stared up at Argrave uncertainly, like he didn't know where he stood, but then moved to pack as well. Durin, Argrave called out. Let's walk for a minute. Are you sure you're better? You look terrible, noted Durin as they walked through the jungle. Argrave touched his face, glad to receive some honesty for once. Annalise always softened her words, and Guilliman and Argrave hadn't talked much at all since he'd enabled Garm to do as he did. I feel good, Argrave confirmed, moving his fingers about. But my nails still haven't grown back. Didn't really know how frustrating that would be. He held his hands out. Putting the gloves on was painful. It's more the sunken eyes and pale skin than some missing nails. You look like my father did. He was dying. Need I remind you? He shook his head. No such luck, though. Well, you won't find that luck with me. Argrave stopped, deciding to tear off the band-aid. Listen, I'm sorry I punched you. Not exactly a good welcome. Durin paused, staring up at Argrave with his golden eyes. He fixed his dark hair. Guilliman said you lie a lot. Guess he was right. Though he was flabbergasted for a moment, Argrave started to laugh once he'd processed what Durin said. Don't apologize. Durin shook his head before he could recover. It's over and done. I won't act like I would do something else in your shoes. And you did save my life. Argrave gave a steady nod, and then stared down at Durin. You said something back then that's been stuck in my gears. You said this needed to happen. This business with Garm. That. Durin scratched the back of his neck. I've been thinking that over myself. Garm wasn't entirely honest with me, let alone with any of you, he admitted. He seemed to hesitate to say more. Maybe it was made up, something to convince me to do what he wanted. But he said his soul was damaged, and if he did nothing, his memories would fade away regardless. What do you think? Argrave questioned, trying to think of the law he'd read long ago. I don't know, he admitted plainly. But, for what it's worth, I believed him back then. Argrave nodded. Strangely enough, that did make him feel better about things, if only just. He scanned the golden tattoos all about the tribal's body as he lost himself in thought, then locked gazes with him. He decided to get to the point. Argrave crossed his arms. Why exactly are you tagging along? I'm an exile. Even if it hasn't been made official, it's inevitable. I was always a bit of an outsider among my people, but after Sathya, I doubt any will welcome me. I have no home. Durin shook his head. Guilliman tells tall tales about a taller calamity coming to ruin the world. I figure that's a worthwhile endeavor to set my sights on, if only to disprove its existence. More than that, Durin pointed up at Argrave. It seems to me you'll be traveling a lot, meddling a lot. More than I care to, Argrave confirmed. But you seem, if not a leader, at the very least, heavily independent. Definitely not a follower. Questioning if I'm worth the trouble? Durin raised a brow. I'm questioning if you can be obedient. Argrave shrugged. I know you're worth the trouble. You're talented. And you're hardworking, a talent on its own. But I know you're pretty whimsical. Argrave uncrossed one arm, gesturing towards Durin. Hell, once the Southron elves told you we'd spoken, you went and found me just outside Cyprus. I can't abide idiotic things like that. That meeting went fine, no? Durin shook his head. You act like we're old acquaintances. Not saying you're wrong with these assertions, but whenever I ask questions about how you know so much, Glimmin and Annalise both clam up, like there's some grand conspiracy. Argrave juggled the pros and cons of informing Durin of his background. Maybe it was his imagination, but he felt he was thinking much clearer these days. Perhaps physical health did improve mental health, and that wasn't just something he'd read somewhere ages ago. That clarity of mind told him it would be best to keep things quiet, at least for now. You'll learn when you're older. Argrave shook his head. Listen, trust will come with time. The three of us are rather accommodating, as long as you stay consistent, open-minded. Argrave shrugged. You'll be welcome. Durin shifted on his feet. I know, I'm the tag-along, with all the burdens that follow. But I made a promise to Calm. I'll keep it. Argrave stared down at Durin. The man held his gaze for a bit, but eventually looked away first. Gods above. Those demon lamps you got for eyes, great reminder of that promise. Durin scratched his cheek. Argrave chuckled, then held out his hand. They shook on the matter. One more thing. Argrave raised a finger, then reached into his pocket. He had to pull aside a sleeping messenger, but he retrieved his bronze hand mirror. Look at this. Durin furrowed his brows but took the mirror. He looked at it. What's this? Some kind of voodoo mirror? He paused. Am I going to regret looking at this? See anything strange? Argrave pressed hopefully. Durin hesitantly moved it about. Just a mirror, leaderman. He shook his head, perplexed. Guess you're not ready, Argrave said, retrieving the mirror. He stowed it away and walked back. What does that mean? Durin called out as Argrave walked away. Hey, wait! He shouted, rushing to catch up. Hash. Feels like I've fallen behind, Argrave mused as he examined the books that Garm had inscribed before his death. Or maybe the alchemist had inscribed them. Argrave was not sure of the process. You had plenty on your plate, Annalise disagreed. And my studies idled as much as yours. Argrave said nothing, opening the book. A spell matrix appeared in the air. A lot of these are very rare, Argrave noted. Labels, descriptions. Garm was meticulous. He shut the book and retrieved another. Holy shit, he exclaimed. Bloodvoodoo? My god. Argrave stepped away, eyes wide. Blood magic? Annalise questioned disapprovingly. Argrave examined the spell matrix with wide eyes and mouth agape. Eventually, his open mouth contorted into a cheek-to-cheek smile. He shut the book, then held it up. This spell is utterly broken. It doesn't work? Durin questioned. No, Argrave shook his head. On the contrary, it's who? He felt lightheaded from excitement. It's B rank, but it's so much more than that. Argrave shook his head, then sat down atop the rock. You can charge it up nearly infinitely. Argrave held the book close. As long as you've got life left, this spell can keep getting stronger. Provided you give it enough fuel, it can fire a single devastating attack that can pierce through any damned defense you can even imagine, and then keep going. But that would be incredibly reckless, Annalise said concernedly. Well, yeah, but Argrave stood. Think about it. This thing synergizes perfectly with electric eel. Shatter defensive wards with one attack, send in the eels at the same time. I wanted to get it, but much, much later. But now. Argrave stared at the white cover. His excitement started to fade when he was reminded that he'd never be able to thank Garm. Because of Garm, I have it now, he said flatly. All this and more. Silence took over their party, barring Gilliman, who still put away books in his backpack. Eventually, Argrave looked off to the side. It's a long way to the Southron elves again. Argrave shook his head. And a lot of stuff to carry. Let's hurry up. I'm eager to see how things changed in our month's absence. But how do we get out? Durin questioned. Same way we got in. Argrave looked off into the depths of the cave. Chapter 158, Stepping aside. Argrave hadn't spoken to Gilliman much at all since Garm was lost to them. Argrave couldn't deny he was upset Gilliman had gone behind his back so blatantly. They sat cross-legged amidst the sand dunes, the night sky above. The chill of winter had set in. They were well into the heart of the cold season. There was an awkward air between the two of them. It reminded Argrave of a dispute with his brother or father. They just avoid each other, saying only words that needed to be said. You look better, said Gilliman. Until they started talking again, like nothing had happened at all. Maybe it was unproductive. I feel better, returned Argrave. But even if it was unproductive, Argrave liked things this way. That's good, nodded Gilliman, white eyes focused on his armor. It was already well maintained, but he kept it impeccably so. Argrave stared as his hands moved, rubbing sand and oil against his armor for reasons Argrave couldn't begin to guess. He looked around. Annalise was taking care of something, Waldron read Garm's writing. Even now, the tribal seemed to be enchanted with it. Though Garm had left some writings related to the soul behind, Argrave still felt hesitant to read them for some reason. His mind wandered, and he wondered what it was like to wear armor all day. Brows furrowed, he turned to Gilliman. "You think I should learn how to fight?" Gilliman paused, then turned his head towards Argrave slowly. "Put Durran down easily enough," he noted with the faintest smile, then focused back on his work. Argrave laughed a little, feeling some strange mix of pride and shame. "I bet he could take me down twice as quick if the aggressor and defender switched places. But seriously, it'd be a good to be versatile. If things go south." Gilliman polished, but Argrave could tell he was thinking of an answer. "The Southron elves put it well. Magic has no ceiling." He looked at Argrave. "Focus on it, you'll keep getting better." "But things happen." Argrave held his arms out, then uncrossed his legs. "Good to learn a trick or two, no?" Gilliman took a deep breath. "For you." His white eyes scanned Argrave. "Your frame got bigger. I used to be your size. Long time ago. I could give you advice for some things." He shook his head. "Even still, I'd focus on learning to be agile. Magic will always be more powerful than a blade. Just dodge, get distance, obliterate them." "Let's hear this advice, then," Argrave suggested eagerly. "Eat more," Gilliman said plainly. "You eat like a bird." Argrave hadn't been expecting that. He'd been shoveling food into his mouth for the past month to the point of vomiting, and the idea of eating more now wasn't particularly pleasant. "Like a bird?" Argrave repeated, drawing lines in the sand. "Must have never seen a pelican." Gilliman said nothing in response. In truth, Argrave didn't fancy the idea of learning how to fight. The few hard knocks he'd taken hadn't been pleasant. He still shuddered when he remembered getting his cheek caved in by June, or the battle with Quarus. Getting up close and personal offered the potential of a lot more of that. Besides, Argrave would much prefer to focus on what he was good at. He could read a book for hours and have a blast, but exercise was different. Whether before or now, he never cared for weightlifting or running. He didn't care about looking well built, either. Dressing nice, wearing jewelry, that was the easier route. Something caught his eye. Annalise returned. He smiled and waved, and she waved back, walking towards them. His thoughts returned back to exercise, but with Annalise's presence now involved, his opinion started to take a sharp turn. "I think I want to build myself up a little," he said decisively, watching Annalise. Gilliman looked to Argrave, then spotted Annalise as well. The big elven warrior laughed quietly. "Something funny?" interrogated Argrave, watching Annalise as she rummaged through her backpack for something. She picked up her small bra messenger, moving it aside, and then reached deep inside. "Sometimes, you do something for someone, and they don't even know it." Gilliman shook his head. "A nice feeling." Argrave looked at Gilliman, puzzled. "Regardless, hope you two stay happy," he concluded. "Well." Argrave scratched his cheek, embarrassed. "You and me both," he finally said. "Thought you might be against this sort of thing." "Why?" Gilliman asked, genuinely puzzled. "You seem like you stick with your own people type of guy." Argrave shrugged. Gilliman laughed loudly, startling Argrave. The man had a scary, grating laugh that would be right at home in a horror movie. Eventually, he settled down, scratching his cheek. "Long time ago, you'd have me completely right." "What changed?" "Living in exile?" questioned Argrave. "Saw the worst of the Vadaman. War awakens the worst." He shook his head. "When war consumes the land, rapists, butchers, sadists, they all come out of the woodworks like rats fleeing from a burning building." "Then," he continued, putting his gauntlet back on, "I came here. I realized things are just the same. You have good people and terrible people," he finished. Gilliman stared at Argrave for a long while, white pupils steady. "That's part of the reason I let Garm do what he did." I recognized him. Argrave tensed when the sore subject was brought up, saying nothing. "The two of you are good," Gilliman concluded. "Not to mention quite compatible." Argrave didn't really know what to say, but Annalise walked up, a book in her hand. Argrave's brimesters jumped free from his clothing, surging before her feet. She stood before him, staring down. "It grows late," she greeted. "We ought to retire. An early morning awaits, especially if we intend to reach Otriksha by the end of tomorrow." Argrave nodded. "You're right, little lady." He stood up and stretched, and his druidic bonds returned to him. "Let's go." Durran stared out at the city of Sethia. Perhaps that was not accurate. He stared above Sethia, at the clouds looming above it. Argrave had to prod him to get his attention. The tribal warrior turned his head to Argrave quickly, stunned and blinking quickly. Sorry, it's just." He shook his head. Never seen clouds over Sethia before. Argrave pondered that springs, rivers, and such still existed in the mountains, and it was a bit difficult to believe that clouds couldn't be blown over Sethia. Presumably, the vessel's presence in the city had something to do with it. The air around them always felt dry. After all, the clouds could be taken as a sign that the city was truly free. From such a distance, Argrave could not deduce how well the city was doing underneath Titus. What he could notice, though, was that Aurum, the Tower of Gold, had been completely taken down. The other two remained standing, but construction around them implied that might not be forever. Wait until you see snow. Argrave pulled Durin along. Crazy stuff. It's white, cold, and it turns into water. PFFT, Durin laughed, regathered. He followed Argrave, and the two of them joined up with Annalise and Gilliman. They passed through a narrow bit of mountain, and beyond, the place opened up into the small town of Otterikshire. The place seemed much busier than before. All in all, the place didn't seem as gloomy as before. Argrave looked around. The Southron elves noticed them, and though caution was their first reaction, many recognized their party. A woman stepped up, crossing her arms before the four of them. Much of her jet-black skin was concealed by thick equipment, likely intended for a forge. "So, you're the reason my father can't walk anymore," Ilchuda began. Argrave turned his head. Once his eyes fell on her, she visibly flinched. He was taken aback by that reaction, but he realized his eyes, Garm's eyes, must have surprised her. Considering her own eyes were pitch black, he was a bit offended. "That's a very pleasant greeting, Ilchuda," Durin spoke before Argrave could set a hostile tone right off. "Very prudent. It's like you're eager to meet your maker." Durin stepped forward, and her eyes widened again. Evidently, she'd not expected to see the man. "Durin," she greeted, taking off her thick forged gloves and holding her hand out. He shook it. "Why are you? A great many people are searching for you, I imagine." He nodded. "They found a spike that fits me perfectly, and they can't wait to put my head on it. I'll pass. A friend of mine told me that's a miserable experience." He looked back to Argrave. "Argrave, this is Ilchuda," Argrave finished. "The best blacksmith for the Southron elves." Though she hesitated, she did eventually hold out her hand to Argrave. He shook it. "Durin knows this, but don't take the rudeness to heart. Our people only say what we really think to people we trust." She shook her head. "My father said good things about you. All of you. He's been saying a lot, lately, considering he's chair-bound. Wants me to forge him a new leg." Argrave nodded understandingly. "If it'll keep him quiet." She laughed. "I see you catch on quick. Or maybe you already got used to the way we talk, what with dealing with the old ones." Argrave called out a familiar voice. Responding to his name being called, Argrave turned his head. Florimond strode out to the crowd. Argrave stepped past Ilchuda, moving to greet the man. He raised his hand up, and Argrave raised his. They swung at the same time, catching into a handshake. "Gods above," he noted, staring at Argrave's eyes. "Those eyes. This is that change you were talking about? Being black-blooded?" "Yeah," Argrave nodded, though it was only a half-truth. It was easier to let him believe what he wanted than explain things. "You look better, somehow," he continued. "More robust. With those eyes, you remind me of some of the half-elven children. The ones that had kids with the golden-eyed tribals. Black on the outside, gold pupils. Sharp instincts." Argrave nodded. "I am a great deal healthier." "That's good." He finally released Argrave's hand. "I'm glad you came by. I thought you would refuse our favor, in part." "I never refuse anything free." Argrave shook his head. "Hardly free, considering you dealt with the Lord of Silver." He shook his head. Argrave smiled. "Speaking of looking better, it looks a lot more lively around here." He glanced about. Florimond looked around, taking in the sights. Things are." He paused, then looked back. "I told you I felt hopeful before." That feeling had only gotten stronger. Behind, Durin furrowed his brows, but Argrave continued oblivious. "How so?" "That city of Sethia. Titus has emerged as the undisputed leader." He linked the Southron elf war relics to other local leaders within the city, used it to seize their assets justifiably. "He rounded up all of the relics and returned it all to us as a show of good faith." "Might not be all, granted, but..." Argrave raised a brow, surprised. "Trading has already begun," Florimond continued, "and it's been equitable. His men have even protected some of us from the more deplorable, elf-hating humans." "What about the tribals?" Durin pressed, stepping forth. "What's happening on that front?" "I don't know much." Florimond shook his head. "Apparently, your father has recovered, and a lot of people are moving to Sethia." "The conditions within the city?" "I haven't been." Florimond shook his head. "All the people who have say conditions are nice. And that big, golden monument has been torn down. Titus minted coins with it." Argrave didn't know what to think of these developments. It was so far removed from what he was familiar with. And all within a month. The possibilities running through his head were infinite. Durin seemed deeply bothered by the news. This was the man who'd very nearly framed him dead. And he was hearing nothing but praise. "Since you're here, I take it you're taking us up on our offer?" "Imbuing some of your weapons with Southron elven magic?" "Ilchuda has been practicing," he pointed. "That's right." Argrave nodded quickly. "And Glimmer's armor needs repairs. If you can manage that." "Done." "You are more than welcome to stay here while this happens." Florimond spread his arms out. "This new hope I feel, it comes in large part because of your efforts." "Good." Argrave nodded. He had been hoping for this. There was much he needed to do, least of all cement their party of four's plan for the plague. Chapter 159, Back to Work. Argrave had wanted a break. In a way, The week spent at the oasis town of Otrixia became just that. The normalcy of opening new spell books and delving into them for hours at a time became a welcome respite compared to the unending torture that had occurred at the residence of the alchemist. He felt like someone who had just recovered from surgery returning to their job, and in a way, that wasn't too far off. The alchemist had said that every function of Argrave's body would be improved. That statement was entirely true. He could focus for longer without exhausting himself. He functioned better with less sleep. And, moreover, he did basic exercise every morning, and ate plenty of what Guilliman suggested. The activity was basic, as mentioned, nonetheless. The improvements felt tangible, especially endurance-wise. It was like he was on a classic diet of chicken, rice, broccoli, and steroids. Hopefully his face wouldn't swell. Darren was restless, constantly inquiring about the state in Sethia. He seemed to have difficulty believing that things were going well under Titus, and though Argrave shared that sentiment, he wasn't near as invested as Darren. Indeed, despite his unease with the development entirely foreign to Heroes of Berenda, things did seem to be improved. Guilliman finally got a chance for a break, too. Beyond giving advice to Argrave, he did little as he waited for the changes to his armor. His greatsword was being modified to accommodate Southron elf magic, and the original enchantment would remain fully intact. Though the offer extended to all his weapons, Guilliman claimed enchanting the dagger would be impotent, and the Ebon-Ice axe interfered with the Southron elf enchantments. Moreover, he needed to see the axe blade to dispel magic. However, the enchanted arrows Guilliman still had were enchanted with Southron elf magic. The arrows would not betray their flight path as they moved. Trivial, considering most people can't dodge arrows, but it might come in handy. Garm's gift of sight had proven to be much more beneficial than Argrave had initially predicted. Perhaps the High Wizard of the Rose had predicted such a thing. Not only could Argrave see other people's magic, he could see his own. Watching it manifest from its raw, almost gaseous state within the body to a genuine spell proved invaluable for comprehension. Argrave understood spells of C rank better, though he heeded Annalise's advice and refrained from tackling B rank quite yet, despite the tremendous increase in advancement lent to him by his black blood. Regarding his new changes, "You want me to drink your blood?" Darren questioned incredulously. Naturally, Argrave nodded as though it was a normal request, acting deliberately obtuse. Darren frowned intensely, sizing up Argrave suspiciously. "Don't you have someone for that?" "He's standing right over there." Darren gestured towards Guilliman. "You got aboard this ship a bit late, so you probably don't know about the amaranthine heart juice." "Magic in liquid form is black," Argrave explained. "When people talk about me being black-blooded, it means that I have magic in my bloodstream. Hence, I'm curious if ingesting it would produce the same effect as it did previously." This wasn't something that could be done in Heroes of Berenda, and Argrave felt it was long overdue to try out something beyond the game's purview. "Can't you ask your lady friend?" Darren stepped away. Snuggling, sharing a bed, fluid sharing isn't such a big step forward. Little bit of blood drinking might be weird, but I'm told some people are into it. Argrave laughed and shook his head. "Come on, don't be a coward," he insisted, wagging his finger at Darren. Darren took a great breath, and then sighed. "Gods above. Fine. You got some ready, or?" Argrave took off his glove and rolled up his sleeve. "Cast some magic," he prompted Darren, then pulled out a knife he'd taken from the kitchens. The tribal looked at Argrave like he was mental, but he did cast a spell. Argrave cut his own arm without much hesitation. After what he'd endured, cutting his arm came quite easily. His blood was indeed much darker, yet still decidedly red. Darren drank. After a time, the tattooed tribal looked a little puzzled. "Yeah, I felt something bubbling near my chest. Felt faint, but present." Argrave drank some of his own blood. Indeed, the feeling was present, but it was far diminished. More importantly, it even worked on himself. "What is this?" Guilliman questioned, having arrived before them all but silently. "Look at this." Argrave spoke to Darren. "He smelled good food, and he comes rushing over." Argrave faced Guilliman. "Don't worry your little head. Just testing something." The big elven vampire frowned. After Annalise and Guilliman caught wind of what he was trying, they quickly put an end to it. Argrave assured them he only intended to use it for emergencies, but even that seemed to make them uneasy. As the days passed by, Darren's insistence on learning what happened after they left only grew worse. Argrave relented to traveling out with him to get a closer look at Sethia, and his companions accompanied him. "If you won't let me go inside, at the very least let me contact Bormask," Darren pleaded, one knee in the black sand of the burnt desert as the four of them stared near the crater leading into the city of Sethia. Sethia had changed considerably. The vast amounts of sand burying the place had been removed, cleaning the place up. Aurum, the gold tower, was gone, and Argent was clearly next on the chopping block. The walls of the city had been badly destroyed, but already, patchwork fortifications had been erected to ward away the elements. "How will you signal Bormask?" "Shout loudly." Argrave shook his head. "It's been a month. Even if you have some signal system, he's probably stopped checking for them by now. On the off chance he's still holding out, we'd still have to wait. I don't want to risk lingering near Sethia and drawing unwanted attention." "Yeah, I got annoyed for waiting on him, too," So we worked out something that'd work quickly, Duran explained. Mounted a mirror some ways away. Come on. Duran led them around the crater surrounding Cethia, herding them to a small circle of rocks. He picked up a metal mount that had a mirror attached to the end. He wiped the sand-covered mirror down with a cloth, and then positioned the mount. Light shone off the mirror splendidly. After some finagling, the ray of light struck a prism hidden within a bell tower. A rainbow consumed the interior, though obviously noticeable to anyone looking for it. It wasn't excessively eye-catching. Now, we wait elsewhere, Duran explained, stepping away. Argrave looked to his other two companions, consulting them. Based on expression alone, none seemed to protest. Annalise obviously wanted to follow, as a matter of fact. In the end, I'm curious, too, Argrave decided, then followed Duran without words. Argrave sat within a small alcove, where ashes evidenced a fire had once been lit. Duran waited impatiently, tapping his wyvern scale boots against the ground. Much longer, Duran, I'm going to call things off, Argrave spoke up. No time for. Glimmin grabbed Argrave's wrist, bringing him to attention. He rose to his feet, hand on his axe, waiting for someone to come. Argrave could hear the faint sound of metal clanging against metal. Soon enough, a bulky man entered into view, a backpack slung over his shoulders. Bbook had removed his armor, and the muffled sounds evidenced he'd hid it within his backpack. Duran, the man greeted. Argrave knew his name was Rolf, but few others did. He had straight blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the archetypal appearance of a paladin, and the man's personality matched up well enough. He was once called the romantic warrior, romantic meaning idealistic rather than loving. He was just, mostly, and devoted to the Vaska pantheon. There was definitely no romance in either, a fact his story revolved around. Didn't think you'd have. He paused when he met Argrave's gaze, obviously surprised. You see something you like? Argrave interrogated. Don't worry about my lamps. I'm sure you know high-rank spellcasters can look quite weird. Bbook entered further into the alcove, giving Argrave a wide berth. I suppose you'd have to be high-ranking to deal with a Lord of Silver as you did. And I'm glad of it. Since you came here with Duran, I suppose you're allies, at least for now? Ever, hopefully, Argrave nodded. Bbook paid little heed to the difference between for now and forever, stepping within and setting down his backpack. The thing clattered noisily. Glimmin watched him cautiously, obviously ready to protect Argrave as needed. That's good. Then I'll start talking. Titus is always well protected. He keeps some highly trained bodyguards with him, some of whom have enchantments from Vaska to better help protect. In addition, most of the guard within the city are, relax, steel-plated assassin, Duran interrupted. Start with the city. How are things for the people? Bbook leaned up against the wall, putting his hands on his knees. Titus is very good at winning over the people, and that's all that I'll say. All you'll say? Stop with the bullshit. Tell me what's happening. Duran rose to his feet, stepping up to the unarmored knight. Befitting the pure warrior from Heroes of Berenda, Bbook was larger than Duran, not by much, though. Bbook stared at Duran, then shifted on his feet, crossing his arms. Sorry, just been a tense month. Prowling Cethia alone. Couldn't wear my armor. Too easily recognizable. Felt unsafe. He lowered his head wistfully. Are you stalling? Get to the point, demanded Duran. Titus had everything ready for the aftermath, Bbook said bitterly. Healers, food, construction supplies. Caravans came into the city for near 2 weeks after the lords were killed before the neighboring cities heard of what had happened. By that point, Titus had already sequestered enough for the whole of winter. He declared you innocent, Bbook pointed to Duran. Instead, he framed other prominent Cethia locals, having them imprisoned and tried. By this point, even though he has no title, Titus is the sole leader of Cethia. The people love him fiercely. He's been doing his best to establish the city once again, both militarily and economically. The blond man rubbed his hands together. That's why things will be difficult for us. Duran looked troubled. He stepped away to the edge of the alcove, staring out across the sand. Are we sure Titus didn't get replaced by someone else? Maybe it's a different guy with the same name. Argrave lowered his head, concealing a small laugh with his hand. Bbook took him seriously, evidently, for he asked confusedly, what are you talking about? He's adept, thoroughly prepared, and he's not exactly ruining people's lives, Duran said slowly. But he has no problems ruining the lives of innocent people, Bbook refuted incredulously, as though he couldn't believe what Duran was saying. The attacks in Cethia, he was the main contributor to all the collateral damage. He framed you and would have had you killed. He's framed more, since all of this kindness, it's a ploy to earn support, and nothing more. Duran had no response to that. Don't just stand there, Bbook continued, stepping up to Duran and grabbing his shoulder from behind. The man is a monster, a butcher wearing a king's mantle. Duran jerked his shoulder away, turning around. And we should do what? Throw the city into chaos while raving about justice? Bbook stared wide-eyed, flabbergasted by the outburst. Argrave glanced around, surveying his party's opinion. He could practically see it written on their face. Both agreed with Duran more than Bbook. And what of the future? Bbook pressed. We allow someone callous to sit on the throne. No matter how benevolent he may be now, when things go awry. A man like that would do anything to retain power. Well, it's clear his strategy right now is to make sure everybody is taken care of, Duran said with a droll anger. Enough supplies for the winter, you said. He's building an economy, you claim. And a military? What might that be for? When your only neighbors are the vessels, what else? Duran spread his arms out in emphasis. Ballmask stared at Duran, jaw clenched tight and brows furrowed. Then what is your plan? I cannot accept you would suggest letting things be. The man tried to kill you. Duran closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm down. When he opened them again, they were full of resolve. I'm not fond of force-feeding people another way of life when they've already decided on one. I wanted to lead my people into a new age. As is clear, I'm not good enough to do so. Duran shook his head. We gave Sethia a choice. Sethia made that choice. Now, I won't be involved with this. I won't cause chaos once again. Ballmask stepped away, expression stern. He turned round, obviously stunned, and paced about for a time. You're going to simply give up? His gaze jumped to the rest of Argrave's party. All of you? Killing Titus solves nothing, Annalise pointed out quietly. He is a strong, decisive leader. Without something prepared for the aftermath, all we do is ruin chances of peace in the city. And, from my perspective, Titus does love this land. Truly. Annalise's words swayed Argrave, and all his indecision vanished. He nodded in agreement. Ballmask glanced around the room, his expression slowly losing anger and tension both. He walked to his backpack, then leaned down to pick it up. His gaze settled on Argrave. I thought, perhaps, one Vaska might be worthy of their ancestors, Ballmask said. It appears I was wrong. Argrave felt great indignance at the claim, but he kept calm. His grimacines mirrored his true emotional state, though, growling at the blonde-haired man. Ballmask slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out quickly, as though he couldn't wait another second to leave. Silence hung in the alcove. Argrave took a deep breath and sighed, a whirlwind of emotion and thought disturbing his mind. He wanted a perfect solution. None existed. I learned what I wanted. Duran broke the silence. Now I'm eager to leave. Long journey ahead, Argrave said distantly. After we get what we need from the Southron elves, it'll be 10 to 12 days, I suspect. Since we'll be avoiding towns, as we planned, we'll stick to the eastern mountain ranges. They have few water sources, but that's no problem for spellcasters. Plenty to eat along the way, even if it might be bugs. Argrave tried not to shudder, the image of a centipede dangling above his tongue. After, we'll take a ruined mountain highway, right into the lion's lap. Duran and Gilliman looked confused, but Annalise caught on. Chapter 160, Sunset for the Desert. Argrave, Annalise called out, drawing him from a book. He read beneath the shade of a palm tree just beside the oasis. His brimacines stood near the buried bodies of the veterans that had fought at Sethia. He had thought the Southron elves might be bothered by this, but rather, they saw it as an honor. They hoped the brimacines would replicate the forms of their fallen warriors, someday. Hey, he greeted, shutting the book at once. Reading what Garm wrote for you? She questioned, walking up. Yeah, Argrave nodded. The stuff about the soul. Gilliman had said it might interest me, and, well, it certainly sounds familiar. He weighed the book in his hand. Just as he wrote, whenever I tried to learn a spell Argrave knew, I learnt it very quickly. I guess if I ever tried torturing people, I'd be a good at that, too. Annalise raised a brow. I take it Argrave was not a good person. If Felipe was their father, they're a bother. Argrave rhymed with a snap. But what do you need? Some questions about our journey back north. About Orion. I was vague about him, but he's my biggest worry. We stand to be here a couple more days. Plenty of time to settle anything that needs settling, I reckon. Yet you are sad, she noted. Argrave turned away, then turned back. I hope that isn't obvious. To me it is. To others, I know nothing of what they notice. She shook her head. What troubles you? Just thinking. Maybe if I had talked to Garl more, something like this wouldn't have happened, he admitted. Her face fell a little. Then it is not me alone thinking like that. Argrave gave a slow, bitter nod. Ironically. Hey, he scratched beneath his nose. If I had trusted him less, he'd be alive now. He lowered his head. Why was I so quick to bring Duran along? I smelled trouble. I knew something was brewing. If I had I would feel a hypocrite consoling you when I feel the same. But truly, these thoughts do nothing for us. Nothing for Garm. Annalise held her hand out. Come with me, she insisted. Argrave looked at her hand. He decisively set the book down and took her hand, standing quickly. She led him through the oasis town, and they waved to the few acquaintances they'd made amongst the Southron elves. Eventually, she ducked into a cavern. Her messenger was lounging away from the sun there, fluffy ears twitching. Argrave was perplexed, but he said nothing. The dark cavern opened up after not 10 steps, revealing a plateau beyond. He sized up the place, searching for something she might wish to show him. He soon realized he was looking in the wrong place, though. The suns were setting. I hoped you would be willing to do this, for me, Annalise began, stepping towards him. Every time the suns descend below the horizon, we could watch them, talk. For an hour or so. With things falling into place, Argrave couldn't stop a smile from appearing on his face. She's more sentimental than she lets on, he realized. but the fact she suggested this meant that moment back then had meant as much for her as it had for him. He held his hand out. "What if we're underground?" "That happens a lot," he asked teasingly. "Argrave, of course we can," he interrupted her before she could misinterpret his answer as hesitance. "That sounds nice. Something to look forward to at the end of the day." Her small frown quickly turned into a smile. "That is good." She took his hand. "I feared it would be difficult to persuade you, especially since your health has improved. But I think this will be good for you, genuinely." Argrave furrowed his brows. "You're not doing this out of obligation alone, I hope." "Well." She paused, pulling on his hand slightly. "Even though you constantly joke, all you talk about is how we are to deal with Gerektig Kiat, the plague. How else am I to ask you questions, learn about you?" She led him towards the edge of the plateau, where she sat. "So, sit, Vincenzo," she said pointedly. Argrave scratched the back of his neck, and then obediently sat. "The only person that still called me Vincenzo was my ma. Most people said Vinny." "Your mother?" Annalise repeated. "A fitting point to start." Glimmin waved his hand, and his Kriegsmesser whistled through the air. The blade of wind created by its enchantments seemed to emerge from a location wholly separate from the blade. But once Gilliman brought it to a stop, the blade distorted back into where it actually was. The elven warrior held it up, studying it without much emotion. If Argrave willed it to be so, he could see the densely packed magic imbued in the blade by the enchantments, placed impressively closely alongside the runes of the Southron elves. Garm's eyes continued to prove their usefulness. "Looks impressive," Argrave said as he stepped forward. "Of course it does," said Ilchuda proudly. "They both do." Durin hefted his glaive aloft in turn, though he did not swing it as Gilliman had. The haft of the glaive had runes just as the blade, shining purple even in the daylight. The black wyvern bone complemented the runes well. "Never worked with wyvern bone before," Ilchuda commented. "Had to read some old texts written by grandfather, back when the stuff was in abundance." "Despite that, worked out well." She looked at Gilliman, jet black eyes scanning his person. She was examining his repaired armor, not his body, though. "Might have worked on adding runes to the armor. But that isn't something that can be done in 7 bloody days." Argrave stepped away, satisfied. "You've done plenty." "In fact, everyone has been far too accommodating," Argrave complimented loudly, looking to Quentin, Florimond, and several other Southron elves who had treated them well. "Gave up a leg fighting for your little coup of Sethia," Quentin noted, and though his words were harsh, he still had a smile on his face. "And now, you made me wait for a new one because your boys needed some little toys." Argrave glanced down at the man's leg, where a stump just below the knee had been hidden by white wrapping. The grizzled, one-eyed veteran walked with crutches even now. "I didn't." Guilt made Argrave trail off, flustered. "Ha ha ha," Quentin laughed, then pushed Argrave. "You should know I don't care by now." His gaze wandered to a set of gravestones. "I got off light, but each and every one of the men buried there followed with the knowledge such a thing might happen," he finished. "Were some funny guys," Argrave reflected, knowing that empty platitudes would earn no respect from the Southron elves. "And all them left descendants behind. If things continue as they are, their line will continue forevermore. And a damned good bloodline it is." Argrave looked about. "Don't get crazy, now." Florimond held out his hand, and several present laughed. That they could laugh amidst grief was a testament to the strength of their people, Argrave supposed, but he felt too uncomfortable to join them. Then, Florimond stepped forth, offering his hand. "Though I hope to see you again, if you say you head to the Northern Kingdoms once again, I fear that wish may never come true." Argrave shook his hand, and then Florimond did the same for the rest of his party. "It's not like we're leaving now, but we'll probably be gone before dawn tomorrow. You might not see me again." Argrave stepped away towards the exit of Otriksha. "But I can guarantee you'll be hearing my name again." Florimond grinned. "Cheeky boy, are we?" "Well." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep my ears open, provided I don't die of old age before then, naturally." With a single wave and a wink, Argrave turned and left, steps weighed down by the books in his pack but lightened by the fire in his heart. Or so he told himself, at least. Back to the road again tomorrow, Argrave told Annalise. "It's become clear to me the future is unpredictable. Going forth, looks like I'll have to rely on knowledge of what is, not what should be." He shook his head. "Precisely because of that, this plague worries me. It's not just a disease, it's, the point of this time, Argrave, is to avoid discussing these matters," she said pointedly. He let out a long sigh, then wrapped one arm around Annalise. "You're right." "Sorry." She rested her head on Argrave's shoulder, staring out across the vast expanse of black sand painted by the light of the setting sun. "We leave tomorrow, though," Argrave repeated himself. His voice grew quieter, and he continued, "I don't really want to leave." "You will never again be sick," Annalise pointed out. "And traveling will come much easier to you, now. Moreover, we are not slated to traverse the Low Way again, if I understand you right." "Yeah, that is true," Argrave nodded. "We'll get those daggers for Gilliman, a flying druidic bond for you to scout with. Both of which aren't especially dangerous. Relative to the Low Way, At least, that's on the path. She lifted her head and rested her chin on his shoulder. Then perhaps there is little to worry about. Spending time with friendly people, learning fulfilling things. Moments like these, Argrave turned his head to face her. It'll be hard to get started again. An idyllic life like this. You say that, but you are already prepared to leave, she noted. You never lack for willpower. Argrave laughed. You're not wrong. Then what is on your mind? She insisted. Why are you worried? Argrave needed his palm. You and Duran stand to be at the highest risk in the northwest. You claimed you were going to take measures, she pointed out. And both of us are healthy. I am young, and I have been traveling with you. We Vadaimon are a hardy people, and the winter will stifle the plague. You say, I can take measures. But that isn't immunity from the plague. Argrave shook his head. She gave him a quick kiss on the cheek. Do not worry, do what you can, and that will be enough. He stayed silent, then nodded with a smile. You're right. I'll do what I can. Not worrying, though. That'll never happen. I am not so helpless, she refuted. Mages of higher ranks are healthier than average humans, and despite your recent changes, I am still one rank above you, B rank. He smiled. I know. And you'll rise further yet, I know. He paused, staring at her awkwardly. What? She pressed, staring steadily, honestly. He rubbed his hands together nervously. The fact that you... That I... He shook his head. The fact that heroes of Berendra existed made everyone feel like an outsider. Everything was something foreign. Even you, he said quietly. Annalise shifted but said nothing, waiting patiently. Now, though, it's starting to feel like I have some connection to this place, this plane, this whatever. He shook his head. It always felt like the world was my enemy, and I needed to struggle against it to stay alive. He held Annalise a bit tighter. Now, I've got a reason to keep living other than just staying alive, and I'll make sure that we make it through this together. She kept her amber eyes fixed on Argrave, then returned his embrace just as tightly. I understand, was all she said, and that was enough for him. If you like this audiobook, subscribe the channel for more videos like this. And join my Patreon if you want to support me, where you can find the complete collection Jackal Among Snakes audiobooks. Hurry up, what are you waiting for? Leave some comment and let me know if you guys like this story, or you have a web novel you like and want to hear its audiobook. I will be happy to create them for you. Please like, share, and leave a comment on the video.